Hey everyone, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy the audiobooks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a Patreon member. As a member, you'll gain the ability to request the next part of a novel audiobook I've uploaded, depending on your Patreon tier.
Elijah Hart ran a hand over his hairless head as he tried to ignore the curious or disgusted glances originating with the plane's other passengers. His lack of hair wasn't really the issue, not by itself, at least. Instead, the real problem was the lack of eyebrows. He'd never really considered how much the presence of those two short tufts of hair affected the way someone looked. Not until he'd lost his, that is. In addition to the alien absence of hair on his brow, he was also afflicted with sunken cheeks, red-rimmed eyes, and a pallid complexion. One look, and anyone who knew anything would recognize precisely what he was. He sighed, drinking in the stale, antiseptic atmosphere. He hated flying, but not because he was terrified of crashing. No, it was more the act itself. The sudden jumps and jerks, the steady drone of the engines, the cramped confines of the cabin, it all added up to a particularly uncomfortable experience that, if he had any choice in the matter, he would have avoided. But some things were more important than the avoidance of discomfort. "Elijah," came his sister's voice, jerking his attention back to the tablet in his lap. Sorry, he mumbled, locking his eyes on the screen. "Chemobrain, I guess?" Alyssa shook her head, pushing a lock of blonde hair back behind her ear before saying, "I wish you would have waited for me to come pick you up." Before Elijah had been diagnosed with cancer and forced to undergo the horrors of radiation and chemotherapy, he and his sister had looked strikingly similar. Now, though, when Elijah looked at his sister's sandy blonde hair and clear skin, he couldn't help but be reminded of all he'd lost. Of everything he'd yet to lose. "It would have just been a waste of money," Elijah said with a tired sigh. "There's no point in you paying for a flight all the way out to the island when I'm perfectly capable of sitting in a plane by myself for a few hours." Of course, Elijah didn't mention the half-dozen times he'd had to race, or hobble, given his distinct lack of energy, to the plane's lavatory to vomit. The treatments had torn him apart, leaving him a shell of his former self. And though he'd recently finished his last round of chemotherapy, he still hadn't had time to completely recover. And he never would either. What the treatment hadn't destroyed, the disease itself had. Soon it would all be over. Or that's what the doctors had said, at least. It was the reason he'd left his home in Hawaii to fly back to Seattle where he'd grown up. He didn't want to spend what little time he had left drugged out of his mind in hospice care. Instead, he wanted to spend it with the only family he had left, his sister, her wife, and their son. Still, just because he preferred going home to lying in a hospital bed didn't mean he was happy with his circumstances. As much as he wanted to see Alyssa and her family, the last thing he wanted was for them to see him wither away and succumb to cancer. He'd have preferred to be remembered as he'd been, vibrant and alive. Not the husk he had become. "Elijah, The tablet stuttered, then went dark. At the same time, the lights in the plane's cabin went the same way, leaving the passengers mired in complete darkness. Someone screamed. Others gasped. Most of the reaction was confined to a low murmur, though. There was no point in panicking. Elijah felt something dig into his forearm, and it only took him a moment to realize that the claw-like fingernails belonged to the woman next to him. He was just about to say something comforting, but his words were cut off when his stomach jumped into his throat as the plane dropped. There were more screams. Elijah's heart pounded, and his stomach clenched. And then he realized what was wrong. The hum of the plane's engines had ceased when his tablet stopped working. Had they been struck by lightning? Or was there some other mechanical issue? He didn't know enough about planes to figure it out. Instead, as was the case with everyone else on the plane, the panic had truly begun to grip him. His fingers wrapped around the armrest, squeezing the hard plastic with every ounce of his meager strength. Elijah had long since come to terms with his own mortality. Death was inevitable. He would just have to confront it a little earlier than most. And though he'd spent a few weeks after his diagnosis railing against his own fate, questioning why he'd been chosen to die an early death, he'd slowly made peace with leaving the world behind. After all, what choice did he have? It was coming for him, regardless of how he felt. Whether it was in a few more weeks or a scant few minutes shouldn't have mattered all that much to him. But it did. With everyone else panicking all around him, Elijah couldn't stop himself from reacting similarly. It was simple human nature at work, and as the plane continued to plummet, his heart raced out of control. He murmured, "It's going to be fine. These planes can glide for miles without power. It's going to be okay." "Why think so?" asked the woman beside him, her voice small, quiet, and terrified. Elijah couldn't see her. It was night, and with the plane's lights having stopped working, he was almost entirely blind. Still, he remembered her being an attractive redhead, and she spoke with an Irish accent. She'd introduced herself out of politeness, but after a 4-hour flight, most of which Elijah spent mired in self-pity, he couldn't remember her name. He wanted to say it was Gwen or something like that, though that might have been completely wrong. I think Elijah never got the chance to finish his statement because, only a moment later, something wholly unexpected flashed before his eyes. A disembodied block of text appeared. "Your planet, Earth, has been touched by the world tree. Scan it." Elijah blinked, thinking that he'd suddenly gone crazy. Perhaps he'd hit his head and hadn't realized it. What the? He never finished that question either, because a moment later, a different message replaced the first. "Scan complete. Grade, unranked." "What is going on?" demanded the red-headed woman. "What does this mean? Who's doing this?" Elijah had no idea how to answer that, so he remained silent. Regardless, the fact that she'd seen the messages as well meant that he wasn't going crazy. Unless her response was part of his delusion. Either way, he didn't have much time to offer any words of comfort because a third notification came closely on the heels of the second. Due to lack of energy and mass, planet, Earth, will be adjusted to multiversal standard. Selective randomization of terrain will occur as mass increases. Stand by for insertion of planetary core. None of it made any sense to Elijah, but the information never had the opportunity to marinate because only a second later, the world shifted. The already pitch-black cabin somehow grew darker, and suddenly, Elijah felt more alone than he ever had in his entire life. He couldn't feel anything. Not the plane's sharp descent. Not the fingernails digging into his forearm. Not the ever-present weakness and nagging nausea he'd felt since the night after he'd first started his treatments. Nothing. Nor were his other senses working properly. The sounds of panicking passengers and the buffeting winds were gone. No antiseptic ozone smell assaulted his nose. There was nothing. Instead, he felt as if he was floating in an absolute void. Fortunately, that disconcerting lack of sensory input only lasted for a couple of instants before he was distracted by yet another disembodied block of text. Planet, Earth, has been accepted for integration into the Kwati sector. Indigenous population given access to the system. Elijah tried to shake his head, but without any senses, he wasn't sure if it did any good. In fact, he wasn't even sure if he had a body in that strange void. He did his best to ignore the existential terror that came with that thought, distracting himself with the information conveyed by the blocks of text. It didn't make any sense to him, but he also couldn't deny that it was happening. After all, the woman sitting next to him on the plane had seen the odd notifications as well. Unless it was all a hallucination brought upon by the combination of his disease and the treatments he'd undergone, it was all really happening. And the implications were terrifying. Specifically, the parts about randomization of terrain. His mind jumped to scenes from various disaster movies he'd seen, and he wondered if the entire world was experiencing a great earthquake or some other massive upheaval. If that was the case, how many were already dead? How many would die? Before he could wind himself up even further, Elijah was confronted with yet another notification. Scanning human, Elijah Hart, 4 aspects. Nature aspect found. Martial aspect found. Scholar aspect found. Generating class choices? It didn't take much internal investigation for those so-called aspects to make sense to Elijah. The nature aspect was probably the most fitting, given that, until he'd been diagnosed with cancer, he had spent his adult life working as a marine biologist. Moreover, he had always felt a certain connection with nature that he'd never been capable of putting into words. Ever since he was a kid, he'd always felt more at home in the wilderness than surrounded by so-called civilization. The same could be said for the scholar aspect, which probably came from his years in college and his career as a scientist. The incredible amount of study required to attain a doctorate had clearly left its mark on him. Since then, his work as a marine biologist had only thrust him deeper into the life of an academic, albeit one who spent more time in the field than in a laboratory. Finally, he considered the martial aspect. That probably made even more sense than the one awarded for his time stuck in the trappings of academia. After all, Elijah had spent much of his youth playing one sport or another. He wasn't always the best at any of them, but he was naturally agile, and what he lacked in sheer physical size, he made up for in dexterity. However, his first love had always been boxing. He'd never been an elite fighter, but that didn't matter. He loved the sport, and as a teenager, most days saw him down at the gym. In college, he hadn't had time to continue boxing, but he'd picked it back up in the years since getting his doctorate. He didn't train as hard as he once had, but he still put in plenty of time. To see that acknowledged by the so-called system, whatever it really was more than a little gratifying. Of course, Elijah couldn't be entirely certain any of it was even real. It could have just been a hallucination. Or perhaps he was already dead, and the whole thing was the result of his last few neurons flashing out of control. In either case, he wasn't given enough time to get into those sorts of existential questions. Instead, he focused on the latest notification to appear before him. You have been awarded 4 choices of class archetypes. Choose well, because this decision will forever affect your path. Well, that's not ominous at all. He felt certain that he'd spoken, but he couldn't actually hear the words. They might have just been thoughts, for all he could tell. As soon as he'd finished reading the last notification, another appeared. Archetype, warrior. A versatile melee archetype, proficient with most weaponry. Features bonuses to durability, strength, and learning martial techniques. Required aspect, martial. Sample class choices. Berserker, guardian, knight, brawler, gladiator. For skill, heavy strikes. Compatibility, 51%. The next was archetype, researcher. Research is the root of all academic pursuits. Features bonuses to memory, calculation speeds, and observation. Required aspect, scholar. Sample class choices. Librarian, tradesman, various, philosopher, doctor. First ability, knowledge repository. Compatibility, 63%. Elijah's eyes found the third option. Archetype, Druid. The Druid is a defender, ally, and cultivator of nature. Features bonuses to natural regeneration, Ethera density, and one with nature. Required aspects. Scholar, nature. Sample class choices. Bard, preserver, fury. First spell, touch of nature. Compatibility, 94%. It feels like a video game, he mumbled to himself. He didn't even think about the fact that the words were lost to the void. Archetype, ranger. The ranger is a hybrid between the druid and warrior archetypes, with strong ties to both the martial and natural paths. Gives up true mastery of either path in favor of versatility. Features bonuses to durability, regeneration, and one with nature. Required aspects. Nature, martial. Sample class choices. Predator, tamer, trapper. For skill, natural instincts. Compatibility, 89%. So, his choices were between becoming a warrior, scholar, druid, or ranger. The first seemed pretty self-explanatory, and if Elijah was reading the description correctly, it would eventually branch off into something more specialized. Given his background as a boxer, he was particularly intrigued by the brawler options. However, he was a little thrown off by the seemingly low compatibility of the archetype. The second choice, researcher, was at first easy to dismiss, but the archetype's descriptions had hinted that magic was now going to be a real thing. As crazy as that sounded, it was much easier to accept when he was floating in a void, deprived of all senses, and seeing a bunch of notification boxes about classes, archetypes, and the randomization of Earth's terrain. And that wasn't even considering the messages concerning Earth's core and increasing the planet's mass. So, with the assumption that magic was real, what sort of secrets could a magical researcher unlock? The archetype had also mentioned tradesman various as class choices that branched off from the researcher archetype. And Elijah had a suspicion that the system wasn't talking about electricians or plumbers. If his experiences in a materialistic society were anything to go by, that might be a route to wealth or importance. Not that either of those things really interested Elijah. So long as he was comfortable and doing something about which he could be passionate, he was happy enough. Even so, the researcher was worthy of consideration, and he couldn't dismiss that archetype out of hand. Next, he considered the third option, the Druid archetype. He really didn't know what such a path might entail, but by the required aspects, he could surmise that it might be some sort of natural wizard, or a scholar focused on the study of the natural world. A plant mage, perhaps. Whatever the case, he didn't know enough about it to choose it. After all, if the notifications were to be expected, these decisions were permanent. And while he didn't necessarily expect to survive much longer, even in the calm void, the plane's descent loomed large in his mind, and he still had terminal cancer to worry about. He would need to make a rational choice. And without further information, there was no way he could choose the Druid archetype. For the first time in his life, Elijah wished he'd spent his youth playing video games like his friends and classmates. However, he'd been too busy with sports, or with his family's weekend camping trips. That hadn't left much time for more than the occasional game, but even that was enough to highlight the similarities between this system and some of the rules that governed role-playing games. Perhaps if he'd spent more time with them, he'd be better prepared to make appropriate choices. Finally, he moved to the last option, the Ranger. It was a blend of the warrior and druid archetypes, which made the choice seem very appealing. However, Elijah couldn't help but think that there should be some sort of drawbacks to the class. He found himself focusing on the description, which said it gave up true mastery in favor of versatility. That planted a seed of doubt. For a long time, Elijah stared at the descriptions, torn between his choices. Indecisiveness strangled his mind, and he found himself incapable of making a decision. It would have been different if he'd had all the information, but those paltry archetype descriptions highlighted just how ignorant he was. Suddenly, another flash of text interrupted his internal debate. Insertion of planet core successful. Due to proximity to high-energy sectors, planets, Earth, mass and energy adjusted. Randomization of terrain complete. Next, the void suddenly disappeared, replaced by the chaos of the plummeting plane. A feminine voice mumbled, "Oh, God, what is going on?" "I don't know," Elijah answered, his own voice quivering with fear. He still hadn't made a choice, so he turned his attention inward. When he did, he saw the same options laid out before him. Warrior, Scholar, Druid, or Ranger. They all had their benefits, and he was certain that they would all have deficiencies too. Meanwhile, the plane found some stability, and it leveled off. The shaking stopped, and Elijah heard more than a few sighs of relief. It was all temporary, Elijah knew. They'd been an hour and a half away from Seattle when everything went dark, which meant that they were still hundreds of miles out to sea. He had no idea how far a plane could glide, but he suspected it wouldn't be that far. Someone shouted over the din of tense murmuring. "Everyone, please remain calm. I've spoken to the pilot, and he says everything is going to be okay. We've lost power, but he thinks." Just then, something slammed into the plane, ripping a giant gash in the fuselage. Everyone screamed, and Elijah caught sight of a huge shadow with a hint of feathers before the plane resumed its sharp descent. Elijah's heart once again jumped into his throat as the plane dropped like a rock. A few unlucky passengers had been torn from their seats and sucked out into the dark night. The wind whipped by, adding to the panic, and Elijah clutched his armrests with all the strength he could muster. It wasn't much. Another furious impact tore yet another gaping hole in the plane, and Elijah was close enough to see one of the wings cartwheeling off into the air. Nearby passengers were ripped free, and they disappeared into the darkness a moment later. That was when it hit him. He was about to die. They all were. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. If the crash didn't get them, then whatever had ripped the plane apart would pick up the slack. The introduction of the system had given a brief glimmer of hope, but reality had come crashing back in a hurry. He was already dead. Between the cancer, the impending crash, and the creature outside, he knew his remaining time was numbered in seconds. That expectation was proved true when, a moment after that thought flitted across his brain, the sound of screeching metal filled his ears as the creature tore into the plane once again. This time, Elijah was one of the unlucky ones who'd been close enough to be thrown free of the plane, and an instant of chaos later, he found himself falling through the air. The starry night twinkled above him as he watched a monstrous, bird-like shape rip into the plane and tear it to pieces. An explosion erupted as something ignited, and Elijah got a brief glimpse of the monster. It was a bird, though its size beggared comprehension. Its wingspan was comparable to the plane's, and it was equipped with talons the size of an economy car. Elijah didn't have the chance to see much more before his fall abruptly ended with a splash and unconsciousness brutally smothered his awareness. His final thought before he completely surrendered was that he still hadn't chosen an archetype. Perhaps he never would. "What the hell is going on?" gasped Alyssa, staring at the disembodied blocks of text. It was too dark to see, but, after that brief period of nothingness, she could feel Carmen's comfortable presence next to her in bed. "You saw it too, didn't you?" "I did," Carmen answered, her hand finding Alyssa's. She squeezed it tightly. Could this be real? Alyssa had already gone through the tunnel of disbelief and come out the other side. No matter how she looked at it, she couldn't see how the situation could be anything but real. It was one thing if it was just her experiencing it, but the combination of the loss of power, the strange period of nothingness, and the fact that Carmen had been through the same thing confirmed the reality of it all. So, she chose to treat it as such. If it turned out that she was crazy, then she would just deal with spending the rest of her life on antipsychotic drugs in a mental institution. "What choices did you get?" Carmen asked. "We'll go over it once we figure this thing out," she said, reaching over to her phone. Fortunately, it still worked, though there was no signal. Still, it gave her a light source. "I'll go check on Miggy. He's probably terrified." With that, she slipped off the bed and, using the light on her phone, headed out of her bedroom, down the hall, and into her 8-year-old son's room. Thankfully, he was more than fine. In fact, he was grinning from ear to ear. When she asked if he was okay, he said, "What's going on? Why is the power out? It's not even raining. Can we play Scrabble?" Of course, that was where his mind would go. For one reason or another, he saw any power outage as an opportunity to play board games, which he loved. Probably because he usually won. "Everything is fine," she said. "Did you see any, boxes?" Clearly he hadn't. Alyssa had no idea why that would be, but that lack of comprehension seemed par for the course. So, she played it off, then led him into the house's living room. For some reason, she had a very bad feeling, like there was something dangerous right around the corner. Part of that was due to the oddness of the situation, but she also knew just how irrationally people tended to act in any emergency. "Okay, so what did you get?" Alyssa asked as she walked into the room. "You first," Carmen said, her feet curled under her on the couch. It was an incongruous position for someone with her particularly muscular physique. Alyssa rolled her eyes. "Fine," she said, glancing at the boxes she'd so far ignored. After the ones talking about Earth being connected to the world tree, whatever that meant, was the one mentioning aspects. She read it, then said, "I got 3 aspects. Martial, faith, and scholar. You?" "Scholar and magic," Carmen said, obviously disappointed. Even if the situation seemed a little ridiculous, she clearly took it just as seriously as Alyssa. "What are aspects?" asked Miguel. "We're not sure," Carmen said. "But for your mom, martial makes sense? Because she's a policewoman? And because I've spent years practicing judo and jujitsu," Alyssa said. "I used to go to the boxing gym with your uncle too." The mention of Elijah brought with it more pain than she'd expected. If his plane had lost power, no, she didn't want to think about that. Where he was concerned, it was easy to sink into a pit of depression, what with his illness. She was prepared to say goodbye, but that didn't mean it was easy. Faith made sense to, especially since her brother had been diagnosed. Alyssa had spent quite a bit of time praying. She rarely went to church, most of them didn't especially approve of how she lived her life, but her religion was still important to her. Scholar was easy. She'd just finished her master's degree in criminal justice, and she intended to pursue her doctorate as well. It was mostly so she would look better when it came to promotions at work, but that didn't change the fact that she'd spent quite a bit of her life studying. For Carmen, the scholar aspect made even more sense, assuming that it was, as Alyssa suspected, a comment on the lives they'd led. Carmen held her own doctorate in history with a specialization in primitive skills. So, most of her life had revolved around her education. As for magic? Well, that was a mystery, but hopefully one they could solve by going through the rest of the notifications. And your archetypes? What's an archetype? Asked Miguel, snuggling close to Carmen. In this instance, I think it refers to as an overall classification. But we're not sure, Miggy, said Carmen. Hopefully we can figure it out together. He nodded along and Alyssa said, I got warrior, priestess, and researcher. You? Priestess? Don't knock it. It says one of the sample classes is a Valkyrie. Sexy, groaned Miguel. What did you get? Repeated Alyssa. 2 choices. Tradesman and sorcerer. Both of which are bullshit. I mean, it wouldn't make me so angry if your classes didn't have feminine suffixes. But you got priestess. Why couldn't I get tradeswoman or sorceress? Come on. I guess they didn't get the memo on gender equality. Obviously. So, which one are you picking? Asked Carmen. Priestess, right? Alyssa shook her head. I'm tempted, she said. Valkyrie does sound cool. But I don't know. Indeed, looking at her choices, she was torn. Given the vague feeling of unease blanketing her mind, she had no intention of choosing researcher. With the power outage and the messages she'd read, it seemed a foregone conclusion that things would get more dangerous. And as a police officer, she was duty-bound to meet that danger head-on and protect the populace. So, her choices were between priestess and warrior. She looked at the first description again. Archetype, warrior. A versatile melee archetype, proficient with most weaponry. Features bonuses to durability, strength, and learning martial techniques. Required aspect. Martial. Sample class choices. Berserker, Guardian, Knight, Brawler, Guard. For skill. Heavy strike. Compatibility, 77%. Then she looked at the one for priestess. Archetype, priestess. Faith is versatile, lending power in a wide variety of ways. Features bonuses to regeneration and Ethera. Required aspect. Martial, faith. Sample class choices. Valkyrie, apostle, chaplain, paladin, inquisitor. For skill. Word of power. Compatibility, 63%. Do you want my advice? Asked Carmen. You know I do. Take warrior, she said. The other one sounds fancy enough, but I know you. You're a fighter. I can't imagine any other archetype describing you any better than that. But what if the other one's better? Carmen rolled her eyes, then raked a hand through her black hair. You always do this, she said. Remember when we used to have time to play games together? You would always second-guess your choices. But believe me, Alyssa, you won't find a better fit than warrior. What about you? Alyssa asked, pushing the choice aside for the time being. Tradesman all the way, she said. Really? You don't want to sling fireballs? I mean, but you know me. I'd rather make things, you know? Besides, I get the feeling that the world's going to need people who can build things, she said. You read those notifications, right? Randomization of terrain? I mean, if I were a betting woman, I'd put money on the reason the power's out is because the grid's fucked. Miguel gasped. You said a bad word. And I'll probably say a lot more before this is finished, Carmen said. Carmen? She rolled her eyes. Fine. I'll put $1 in the swear jar in a minute, she said. Of course, money's probably useless right now. What? Why? Asked Alyssa. That always goes first, doesn't it? With the power being out, credit cards and stuff are useless. The same for paper money. Haven't you ever watched a zombie movie? Society's about to collapse, Alyssa, she said. This is not a zombie apocalypse. You know that for sure? Carmen asked. I mean, maybe not the zombies. But I just got told by a magic box only I can see that I could be a sorcerer. So, who knows what's going to happen? My point is that apocalypse rules are definitely in play. Food, water, shelter, and security. Those are the priorities. You think it's going to get that bad? Alyssa asked. As a police officer, she had training for that kind of scenario, but she'd never really taken it seriously. Sure, she was prepared to respond to active shooters and terrorist scenarios, but the full collapse of society definitely seemed a bit far-fetched. Carmen shrugged. I have no idea, but I think it's possible, she said. Okay, so first things first, Alyssa said, deciding that it was better to treat it as an apocalyptic emergency and be wrong than the opposite scenario. We need to catalog our supplies. You and Miggy go to the kitchen. Did you seriously just tell me to go to the kitchen? Asked Carmen with a grin. This isn't time to joke, Carmen. Once again, Carmen rolled her eyes. Fine. But I want it on record that you're no fun. I mean, assuming we're not crazy, we just got offered magic powers. Or at least I did, she said. That's kind of a dream scenario for me. Except the apocalypse part you just predicted. Well, the world has too many people anyway, she remarked. Maybe Roy will get eaten by a zombie. Or turned. Then I can legally blow his head. Carmen. Who's Roy? Asked Miguel. Someone your mom knows from work, Alyssa said, referring to the head of Carmen's department. He was a blatant misogynist who constantly questioned her work, belittled her at every opportunity, and had even come on to her on more than one occasion. He's not important. Unless I need to rid the world of a Roy-shaped zombie. There aren't any zombies. You don't know that. Alyssa let out a long-suffering sigh. You're a child. I'm young at heart, which is why you love me, Carmen pointed out. Anyway, you two take stock of the food, Alyssa said, moving on. I'm going down to the basement to get other stuff. That was where she kept the gun safe, which, given what Carmen had predicted, seemed extremely important. Even if it wasn't a zombie apocalypse, which sounded silly even in the context of what had happened so far, there was every chance of looters and other violent lawbreakers. And even if she had no intention of exercising lethal force, she was prepared to do whatever it took to protect her family. Aren't you forgetting something? What? Your archetype. You really should choose something. You get bonuses to your stats and stuff, Carmen said. Stats? Like a video game? Just like a game. Alyssa shook her head, then confirmed her choice to become a warrior. When she did, she got a notification congratulating her on it, then another window opened soon after. Name: Alyssa Hart. Level: Archetype. Class: not applicable. Specialization: not applicable. Alignment: not applicable. Strength: dexterity: 7. Constitution: regeneration: movement: cultivation: body: formed. What does all of this mean? She asked. Before Carmen could answer, another notification popped up, telling her that she had 10 free attribute points to spend. It means that all that weightlifting I did was completely useless, pouted Carmen. Indeed, that was her primary hobby and means of stress relief, and her physique showed it. She'd never been one for heavy cardio, but she had long since cultivated a body studded with bulging muscles. Of course, some of that was mitigated by the fact that she was, at best, an inch over 5 feet tall. By comparison, at nearly 6 feet tall, Alyssa was extremely tall for a woman, and though she worked out as well, her routines were more for endurance, resulting in a much slenderer physique. Kind of depressing, really, Carmen remarked. Then she perked up, adding, but on the bright side, I put all my points into strength. So, I can probably lift a car now. Didn't think it would be smarter to, spread the points around? Nope. Alyssa shook her head, and after spending a few moments reading what each attribute did, decided to follow her own advice, allocating 2 points into each category. As soon as she did, she let out a gasp as a wave of what could only be called rejuvenation swept through her. That's the good stuff, right? Said Carmen, still grinning. Alyssa didn't answer. Instead, she focused on the fact that, if she could feel something like that, then the chance, slim though it was, that it wasn't real became even more unlikely. In the middle of her thought, something banged against the door. She flinched. Carmen grabbed Miguel, clutching him with her thick arms. Then a familiar voice called out, "Alyssa, it's me. Open up." Alyssa let out a sigh of relief, then crossed the living room to the door. When she flung it open, she saw a tall, broad-shouldered and athletic man in his mid-40s. "What's up, Chief?" asked Alyssa, looking past him and the petite blonde woman clutching his arm. The street was dark. "Shit is going to go wrong real quick out there," Roman Kane said. He was both the police chief and her neighbor. "Thought we all might be safer together." Of course, Alyssa knew that he hadn't come for his own good. Rather, He'd done so for his wife, who was good friends with Carmen. Yeah. Probably for the best, Alyssa said, stepping aside. Come on in. Elijah dreamed of his puppy, Fremont, nipping at his legs as he read a book. The dog was a rambunctious thing, still untrained, and full of energy and cuddly love. Slowly, his rational mind intruded on the pleasant dream, telling him that his dog hadn't been a puppy for years, that he'd been forced to rehome him when it became clear that the cancer was incurable. Doing so had been almost as emotional as when his oncologist had informed him that the treatments weren't working, that he only had a few more months to live. Gradually, Elijah's memories distorted, and the puppy's nipping bites became something altogether more painful. Punishment for the abandonment Fremont had doubtless felt at being left with a neighbor. Suddenly, Elijah's eyes fluttered open as pain lanced through his leg. He kicked out, but the pain only increased. Moreover, there was something digging into his arm, too. He spasmed, waving his arms and legs as he tried to dislodge whatever had assaulted him, eventually jerking himself free and clambering away. His hands found scant purchase on the slippery rocks and gravel as he crawled away, and he vaguely noticed the steady lapping of waves. The unmistakable smell of the sea. The biting ocean wind. That's when his memories began to assert themselves. The plane. The cancer. The system. Gasping, he pushed himself to his knees and looked around. As he'd suspected, he was on a rocky beach, but only a few dozen feet away, there was an incredibly dense forest. The sky was gray with clouds, and the steady sound of the waves, accompanied by a strange clicking sound, filled his ears. He turned his attention in the sound's direction, and his eyes widened at the sight. At first glance, it was just a crab, little different from thousands of others Elijah had seen throughout his life. However, it differed in a couple of notable ways. First, it was a perfect example of a purple shore crab. Dark maroon in color, it had stout claws, which bore slightly darker spots. However, unlike its more typical brethren, which were usually only a few inches across, this one was the size of a cat. Elijah scrambled backwards when he saw a dozen more of the creatures bearing down on him, each of similar size. But they followed, judging by the frayed edges of his pants and the wounds beneath. The little scavengers had thought him dead, and they'd been feeding off of him. More importantly, they didn't seem all that enthused about losing their meal. The first few scuttled forward in a sideways shuffle, and when Elijah didn't react, the rest followed. He reacted on instinct, kicking out with bare feet. Apparently, he'd lost his shoes at some point, though he didn't have time to lament the loss. Instead, the whole of his attention was occupied by defending himself from the horrifically huge crabs. He connected with the first, his foot hitting its incredibly hard shell. It did little damage, but the thing couldn't escape the reality of its small size, and the momentum of the kick sent it sailing through the air. But it also opened Elijah up to the rest of the crabs, which assaulted his legs with their oversized claws. Snapping, ripping, and tearing, it wasn't long before his lower legs were a bloody mess, with ribbons of flesh hanging off in strips. A few of the claws had cut right through his muscle, stopping only when it reached the bone. Elijah panicked, kicking out with renewed fury, but his strength waned with every blow. Whether it was blood loss, his pre-existing conditions, or simple fatigue, he didn't know. What he did know was that he couldn't continue in that manner. So, after he kicked another one away, he levered himself to his feet, then leapt, pushing off with all of his strength. He barely cleared a few inches. But it was just enough that when he descended atop the closest crab, he felt the thing's shell crack and crunch beneath his bare feet. The shards of shell pierced the soles of his feet, but he didn't allow himself to stop, stomping down as hard as he could. Over and over, until the creature had been reduced to a slurry of shell, crab meat, and its juices. Seeing the other crabs surrounding him, Elijah stumbled away, scrambling over the rocks as best he could. He left a trail of blood and bits of ruined flesh behind, but adrenaline drove him forward and into the trees. He glanced back to see that the crabs had descended upon their fallen fellow, and he sighed in relief. Still, he kept going into the thick forest, only collapsing a few dozen feet in. Crabs wouldn't go too far inland, so he felt like he was safe. Even so, the presence of the abnormally large crabs was a troubling thing. But it was nothing compared to his ruined legs that increasingly refused to follow his commands. A few more feet and he tumbled to the ground. Elijah dragged himself forward until, at last, he could turn over and rest his back against a pine tree. Finally, he let himself relax, and in that moment, another block of text appeared before his eyes. Congratulations for defeating your first foe. Status unlocked, accessed via mental command. There are many ways to advance in this universe, and killing is only one of them. Explore the system to discover your own path to power. Elijah was both alarmed and relieved to see that his memories on the plane hadn't been a hallucination. Relieved, because one of his most potent fears was losing his mind. He'd watched his grandmother descend into dementia, and those memories had stuck with him ever since. He'd experienced some mental decay during his treatment, a side effect colloquially known as chemo brain, and he'd have rather died than go through any more decline in his mental faculties. After a second, during which he grew increasingly lightheaded, Elijah decided to distract himself from the pain by taking a look at his so-called status. When he thought of it, another box appeared. However, this one was divided into various categories. He studied it. Elijah Hart, level, archetype, Druid, class, not applicable. Specialization, not applicable. Alignment, not applicable. Strength, dexterity, constitution, regeneration, 7, movement, cultivation, body, font. Below the status was another box which said, you have 10 attribute points to spend. Each level you gain will grant you 2 more points to spend as you wish. Upon reaching level 10 and gaining a class, each level will come with an automatic allocation based on your class. Some classes will grant additional free attribute points. Choose well. All decisions have consequences. You have 10 attribute points to spend. Each level you gain will grant you 2 more points to spend as you wish. Upon reaching level 10 and gaining a class, each level will come with an automatic allocation based on your class. Some classes will grant additional free attribute points. Choose well. All decisions have consequences. That was comforting, at least. Elijah had no context for what the numbers on his status page really meant, but he suspected that 3s and 4s weren't high. Most of that could be attributed to his disease, which had sapped his muscle mass like nothing else could. But the 1 point in constitution was more than a little troubling. Obviously, he knew what strength and dexterity were. One represented physical power, while the other was probably representative of his coordination. And constitution was likely tied to his body's durability. Regeneration was self-explanatory as well, and he felt certain that it governed his ability to heal. That it was his highest attribute was both comforting and a little disappointing. Comforting because it meant that, if he managed to survive for any length of time, healing quickly would almost assuredly prove invaluable. Disappointing, though, because his other attributes were so low. Even though he had a good idea what each category meant, Elijah focused on strength, which brought up a new box. Strength determines physical might. That was in line with Elijah's expectations, so he quickly moved on to the next attribute. Dexterity determines coordination and reaction speed. Again, that made perfect sense, given the word's definition. However, what was left unsaid was that, between the two of them, they represented a much larger concept. Strength wasn't just about lifting heavier things. Instead, it described explosive movement as well, which in turn would determine how quickly he could cover ground. However, without coordination, that ability would be useless. With both high strength and dexterity, he would be able to move incredibly quickly. But if either of them lagged behind, his speed would suffer. Next, he looked at constitution. Constitution determines the body's stamina as well as resistance to physical and magical damage. This was the third piece of the puzzle and confirmed that all 3 of the physical attributes worked together. Strength gave him power. Dexterity gave him coordination. And constitution would give him the capability of harnessing those attributes to their fullest effect. Without it, he could easily envision a scenario where he quickly ran out of stamina, or one where his body simply couldn't endure the strain. He would have to keep that in mind going forward, lest he grow lopsided and incapable of using his attributes properly. Ethera determines the size of the pool of energy used to empower magical spells, skills, and techniques. Ethera was the first of the attributes to truly surprise him, but the description was as straightforward as he could have asked it to be. As was the case with the numbers representing his attributes, he had little context for what it really meant, though. If he ever got a spell, skill, or technique, he would be able to experiment and find out more. So, he moved on to the final attribute, regeneration. Regeneration determines physical healing as well as Ethera recovery. This was another surprising attribute. In addition to the effect he'd suspected upon reading the name, it also determined how quickly his pool of Ethera regenerated. It didn't take a genius to figure out that it would be incredibly important, and it wasn't difficult to imagine a scenario where he had a huge pool of available Ethera, but once he used it all, it might take him an eternity to regenerate it. With a sigh, Elijah leaned back, staring at his status screen. As he did so, something nagged at him, niggling at the edge of his awareness, like he'd forgotten something very important. Then it hit him. He hadn't chosen an archetype, but there it was on his status screen. Druid. The system had chosen for him. With focused thought, he found that he could cycle back through his notifications, and as he did, he found the moment he dreaded. Due to failure to choose an archetype within 12 hours, one has been chosen for you. Choice made due to compatibility. Then, there was another notification informing him that he was now a druid, whatever that entailed. The decision had been taken out of his hands, but for some reason, Elijah wasn't upset about it. In fact, it felt entirely appropriate. Perhaps the system knew what was best for him after all. On his status sheet, Elijah focused on his archetype, and yet another table opened before his eyes. Archetype, Druid. The Druid is the defender, ally, and cultivator of nature. Features bonuses to natural regeneration, Ethera density, and one with nature. Required aspects. Scholar, nature. Touch of nature. Harness the power of nature to heal yourself or an ally. This notification was the most welcome one he'd yet seen, and he couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. However, just because he had the spell didn't mean he knew how to use it. And given that he had precisely zero experience with magic, or Ethera, as it had been called, he didn't like his chances of figuring it out. Still, given the state of his legs and his body in general, he felt certain that touch of nature was the key to his survival. First, though, he decided to use his free attribute points. With his body ravaged by cancer, he felt that there was only one choice. He wouldn't get such an influx of attribute points anytime soon, so if he was going to fix himself, he needed to do it now. Even then, he wasn't entirely certain that it would work. Was the damage already done? He had no idea. But until he felt like the cancer was gone, he would continue to invest his attribute points appropriately. At first, he considered investing them in regeneration, though that just didn't feel right to him. That attribute was already pretty high, and he was still dying. No, if he wanted to make it through the cancer, investing in constitution seemed like the better option. To that end, he flicked his mind at his status screen, mentally willing it to add his free points into the constitution attribute. Once he was finished, a new box of text appeared before him. You have spent your free attribute points. Would you like to make this allocation permanent? Elijah hesitated. If he was wrong, he was probably sentencing himself to death. So, even though he felt confident in his reasoning, he mentally retracted the attributes until only one had been allocated. Then he confirmed it, bringing his constitution up to 2. He didn't feel that it made any difference, so he added another. Then another. He kept going until he reached 5 points, only stopping because he finally felt something changing. Suddenly his body clenched, his every muscle going taut. It only lasted a few seconds, and when his muscles finally loosened, he felt better than he had in weeks. Probably better than at any time since he'd begun his treatments. That was all the confirmation he needed before slamming every free point into Constitution. That was a mistake. A strangled groan escaped from between Elijah's lips as he went completely stiff. His body trembled with exertion as he felt vitality flood his body. Blessed, agonizing life. Minutes later, when he went limp, he let out a long, quivering sigh of relief. His body was still weak, but it was a natural weakness, not unlike he'd felt after spending a couple of hours in the gym. It was a far cry from that feverish lack of strength he'd felt for the last few months. Was he certain that the cancer was gone? But he had reason for hope. And sometimes, that was enough to change a person's entire outlook on life. I think we have enough for a couple of weeks, so long as we ration, said Alyssa, looking over the stacks of canned food on the table. There were other dry goods as well, but not nearly as many as she'd hoped. Makes me wish I'd made a Costco run before, the end of the world. Roman shook his head, saying, I'm not that worried about food. We have the garden out back too. What really concerns me is water. Alyssa looked away, then ran a hand through her hair. It was so difficult to wrap her head around the fact that the world had changed overnight. However, when the sun had risen, she'd gone outside to survey the damage, and she'd been shocked to discover that, instead of the familiar skyline of Seattle, all she saw on the horizon was mountainous wilderness. The rest of her neighborhood was still there, and though she saw hints that the nearby town of Easton had survived, she anticipated that she'd only seen the smallest fraction of the changes that had taken place. Further supporting that assumption was the fact that utilities hadn't been restored, meaning that in addition to the lack of power, cellular service had been suspended, probably due to issues with the cell towers. But that wasn't an immediate concern. The biggest issue was that, because of the transformation of the terrain, water service had been cut as well. Lake Eden is only a few miles away, Alyssa suggested. And we can set up some buckets for rain collection for the short term. And if it doesn't rain? Asked Roman. He glanced toward the basement ceiling, almost as if he could see the others in the house above. He took a deep breath, then said, I think we need to go to the store. Alyssa leaned forward, hands on the table, and sighed. As a police officer, she'd often had to deal with shoplifters, and during some periods of civil unrest, she'd had to respond to looting as well. So, what Roman had suggested didn't really sit well with her. However, it wasn't as if she was contemplating stealing televisions and cell phones. This was a matter of survival. So, it just didn't feel right. But considering that the world as they knew it had just ended, her moral quandary felt more than a little silly. We only take what we need, she said. Roman shook his head, then put his hand on her shoulder. I don't like it either, he said. It's been less than a day and already, we're talking about breaking the law. I'm aware. But the thing is, this isn't anything like what we've been trained for, he said. This is survival. I just told myself the same thing, she stated. And if we don't do this now, there's not going to be anything left, Roman pointed out. We need to take care of our immediate survival. You have Miggy. I have Trish. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure they get through this. Next to that, legality doesn't matter. Hell, I'm not sure morals even come into it. Alyssa shook her head. One day. That was all it had taken. And if they were thinking that way, then everyone else was too. The moment that thought crossed her mind, she knew that the situation was going to quickly deteriorate. Easton had never had much of a criminal element. That was why she'd moved to the suburbs in the first place. But when people got desperate, social order had a way of being tossed by the wayside. Roman's suggestion proved that. The real problem was that Alyssa couldn't really counter it. Food and water were going to be issues. That was a fact. And given the choice between watching her son die of dehydration or hunger and following the law of what may well have been a fallen civilization, she knew precisely which option she was going to choose. So, in that context, Alyssa said, we need to get going soon. Manning's isn't huge, and if we take too long, it'll be picked clean. With that decided, Alyssa and Roman went upstairs to inform the others of the plan. Everyone agreed that it was the right course of action, but, predictably, conflict reared its ugly head when they realized that they were going to be left behind. Trish said, it's just a mile or so. What could go wrong? I don't want to be cooped up in this house, and I'm sure Carmen doesn't either. It might be dangerous, Roman said. Think about it. None of us have really tried out these abilities, but... I tried mine out, Carmen pointed out. I mean, bind isn't meant for fighting or anything, but... Nobody said anything about fighting, Alyssa interrupted. That's because you don't want to admit the obvious, Carmen countered. But I think what Roman was going to say is that people are probably panicking right now. And they have magic abilities. More than that, some of them have definitely come to the same conclusion you two did. Given that, there's a good chance that they'll try to keep others from taking resources that might ensure their own survival. It's been less than a day. Trish insisted. You act like all of society is going to collapse just because the power is out. Trish, you haven't been outside yet, have you? Said Carmen. Alyssa added, Trish, this is way more than just the utilities being cut. The whole world has changed. Did you even read the notifications? I skimmed them, she admitted. Something about world trees and whatnot. Seemed like nonsense. Alyssa massaged her forehead in frustration. You did pick an archetype, though, right? Yes. Roman made me choose healer. Alyssa let out a sigh of relief. Then she said, okay, I think it's best if we figure out what everyone chose and test out our abilities before we start running around. Like Carmen said, it might get dangerous out there. She looked around, then went on, guess I'll go first. I picked warrior. And the ability I got was heavy blows. She navigated to the ability's description. Heavy blows. Increase the damage of your melee attacks by 5%. Toggled personal augmentation. It just says it increases the damage of my attacks by 5%, she explained. Apparently, it's its toggled personal augmentation, whatever that means. Self-buff, said Carmen. All but Miguel narrowed their eyes in confusion. Oh, come on. None of you play video games? It's obvious. I only play sports games, said Roman. I like Candy Crush, Trish stated. Alyssa asked, you really think this system is like video games? I mean, what are the odds of that? Carmen shrugged. I mean, there are probably all sorts of explanations that would make sense, she said. Maybe the system seeded the ideas a long time ago, guiding us so that it would make sense when we were touched by the world tree. Or, that sounds like the world tree is some kind of sexual deviant, said Trish. It's a tree. She shrugged. Still not the best phrasing, Trish persisted. Carmen rolled her eyes, then said, anyway, my point is that the explanations don't really matter. It is what it is, and I get the feeling that if we keep questioning it, we're going to end up dead. Accept it, adjust, and move on. Or that's what I intend to do, at least. So, in that spirit, I took tradesman, and my first ability is bind. It lets me bind two materials together. What use is that? Asked Roman. For combat? Nothing that I can think of, Carmen answered. But for making things? I mean, it should be incredibly useful going forward. You took a non-combat option? That's the stupidest thing. She crossed her arms and interrupted. I also put all my extra points into strength. So watch what you say, big guy. Calm down, said Alyssa. I'm sure Carmen can pull her own weight and then some. Besides, people who can make things are going to be valuable. You've got to see that, Chief. Roman shook his head. Whatever, he said. Guess I'll go next. I took marksman. Ability I got was aim, which I can use to increase the damage of any ranged attack by 30%. Wow, that's nice. I don't think it works on guns, though, he admitted. Why do you say that? He shrugged. Instinct? I don't know. It's weird. Does that make any sense? He asked. Alyssa said, kind of. My ability kind of came with something similar. I sort of know how to use it, at least. Yours is probably the same way. Stop trying to make sense of it, Carmen advised. Just accept it. Probably for the best, Roman said, shaking his head. Then, to Trish, he continued, all right, babe. Tell them what you got. It's called mend. I don't know. I guess I can heal people with it. Just wave my hand and they'll get better? It feels kind of like it would be strong, but it also comes with, I don't know. Sort of like if I cast it, I won't be able to do it again for a little while. Cool down, provided Carmen. Everyone looked at her and she said, game term. Sorry, what about the kid? Asked Roman, gesturing down the hall where Miguel was asleep. He tried to stay awake, failing spectacularly. He get an archetype too? And what are we going to do with him when we go for supplies? He didn't see anything but the initial notification about the world changing, Alyssa answered. And if we're all going, we need to take him with us? Roman shook his head. That'll complicate things. Non-negotiable, said Carmen. Fine. But if it's dangerous out there, I'll take care of him, Carmen stated. Alyssa was quick to voice her own agreement. While Miguel wasn't her biological child, she'd helped raise him since he was a toddler. So, in every way that mattered, he was as much her son as if he'd come from her own genes. Roman shook his head, saying, "But if you're taking care of him, you're going to be distracted when we might need you to." "Drop it," said Trish. "Just drop it. If we had kids, I'd want to keep them close too. Especially if things are as bad as you say they are." Roman had clearly been outvoted, so, as his wife had suggested, he dropped the topic. Instead, they all went out to the backyard, where they spent a little time practicing their abilities. From Alyssa's perspective, there really wasn't much to practice. She just had to use her ability, and it would remain active indefinitely. Perhaps there was some other limiter, but if there was, she couldn't find it. Trish's limitations were far more prominent, and after spending almost an hour testing things out, they determined that the cooldown after using Mend was nearly 15 minutes. "Feels crazy to complain about magical healing, but that seems like a pretty harsh cooldown," said Carmen, pressing two old fence boards together. They stuck, which seemed to be the limits of what her own ability could accomplish. "Still, I guess we just save that for emergencies." Roman, who'd retrieved his hunting bow from his house next door, shot an arrow at a target he'd set up at the other end of the yard. It was only a few dozen feet away, and when he loosed the arrow, it whipped across the lawn with the speed of a bullet, tearing through the target, a fake deer meant for hunting practice, and hitting the shed behind it. "Damn," he said. "Impressive," agreed Alyssa. "Haven't shot this thing in years." No time for hunting, lately. Indeed, Roman had been promoted to police chief only a year before, and since then he'd been putting in 70-hour work weeks. That he was home when the world went crazy was just a stroke of good luck. After everyone had gotten comfortable with their abilities, Carmen went inside to wake Miguel up while everyone armed themselves. Roman and Alyssa both strapped their service pistols to their hips, while Trish was given a shotgun. She handled it with some familiarity, reminding Alyssa that the other woman had spent her fair share of time at the range. Carmen carried an old softball bat and an ancient revolver that had belonged to her father. Despite its age, it was in good condition, and like Trish, Carmen knew her way around some firearms. The only one who was unarmed was Miguel. No one wanted an 8-year-old running around with deadly weapons, after all. Still, he put himself to use by carrying spare ammunition and bottled water in his backpack. Thus prepared, the group set out for their local market. Alyssa kept her hand on her pistol as she walked down the center of the street. Behind her followed Carmen, their son Miguel, and Trish. Bringing up the rear was Roman, who was holding his bow. With her shotgun in hand, Trish complained, "Is all this really necessary?" "Maybe. Maybe not," Carmen said. "But I've watched enough zombie movies that I'm more than willing to be overly cautious." "There are zombies?" "Cool," said Miguel. "I still can't believe you let him watch Walking Dead," Alyssa muttered just loud enough that her wife could hear it. "In my defense, I didn't expect him to like it so much," Carmen remarked. "Especially after the first season when the quality went downhill." "I liked it," Miguel countered. "Because you're 8 and you don't have taste. It's not your fault. You just haven't experienced enough variety to know when you're watching trash," Carmen stated. She reached out to ruffle his black hair. "But I still love you even if your taste leaves a lot to be desired." He dodged to the side, avoiding her hand as he whined, "Mom, Alyssa ignored their back and forth as Carmen teased their son. Instead, she focused on her surroundings. It had been a troubling discovery to find that none of their vehicles worked. Even Carmen, who knew a bit about working on cars, had been stumped as to why they were inoperable. She tried to change the batteries and even inspected the spark plugs, but everything appeared to be in working order. They just wouldn't start. So, the group had been forced to head out on foot as they sought supplies at the local grocery store, Manning's Market. It was only a couple miles away, so they reasoned that the trip shouldn't prove too arduous. By the time Alyssa and the others reached the end of their street, she was beginning to rethink that assessment, chiefly because of the hole that had been ripped in the side of one of the houses. "How did we not hear that?" she asked, ready to draw her pistol. She also had an old machete sheathed on her other hip, but she hoped she wouldn't need to get close to whatever was capable of tearing a hole in a building. "What even could do that?" "I don't know," said Roman, having already knocked an arrow. "And I don't want to find out either." The house was barely standing, with a good portion of the roof having collapsed when something had torn through a load-bearing wall. "We need to check it," Alyssa said. In case someone inside needs help? Roman started to respond, and judging by his expression, he intended to argue for ignoring it. It was strange how quickly he'd abandoned his role as a public servant dedicated to the safety of the townspeople. But then again, judging by what she'd seen so far, the town didn't really exist anymore. Not in any way that mattered, at least. If someone's hurt, I can help them, said Trish, already moving to cross the lawn. Honey, though? She turned, backpedaling for a moment as she said, "It's fine. It was probably just a—" She never got the chance to finish her thought before something came tearing out of the house, moving so fast that Alyssa had difficulty tracking it. In the space of a second, it was already bearing down on Trish. She screamed and tried to run, but as panicked as she was, she only got a step before stumbling. And then, the creature was upon her, latching onto a hastily raised forearm. Blood misted, and the sound of a breaking bone filled the air, accompanied by Trish's agonized shout. And then gunshots sounded. Alyssa fired once, twice, then 3 times. Each shot took the furry creature in the ribs, but it didn't release Trish's arm. Suddenly, an arrow sprouted from just behind its foreleg. Then Alyssa heard the thwop of a bowstring before another joined the first. It yelped, releasing Trish, who fell to the lawn where she clutched her arm as a mewling sound escaped from between her lips. But Alyssa only had eyes for the creature before her. It resembled a wolf, though it was at least the size of a pony. And its coloring was different from any canine she'd ever seen. Predominantly black, the thing's fur had green and blue streaks as well, which gave it a distinctly alien appearance. Alyssa advanced, firing her weapon over and over again as she emptied the magazine into the monster. It didn't die. Instead, it leaped to its feet and stumbled back towards the house. It never got to its destination. As Alyssa fired her gun, Roman continued to loose one arrow after another until, after 7, it finally slumped to the ground. Still, it wasn't dead, though that wouldn't last much longer. Alyssa had been hunting with her father enough that she could recognize when an animal was on its last leg. Soon it would bleed out. She wasn't willing to trust that assumption. So, Alyssa strode forward, dragging the machete from the sheath at her waist, until she stood over it. Then, without further hesitation, she reached back and chopped into the monster's neck. The blade cut deep, splattering blood on her pants, but the monster still clung to life. So, she swung again, and at last, it perished. Breathing hard, more from panic as exertion, she turned and demanded, "What the ever-living fuck was that?" No one paid any attention to her, though. Instead, they'd all descended upon the injured Trish. When Alyssa joined them, she saw that the other woman's arm was misshapen, covered in blood, and had bones sticking out in multiple places. More, it looked the wolf creature's claws had clipped Trish's upper thigh, which was gushing blood. Clearly, it had hit an artery. "You have to use your ability," Carmen was saying. "Spell? What? It's a spell. Not an ability. Whatever it's called, use it now or you're going to bleed out." Carmen spat. It made perfect sense, but still, Trish looked at Roman and waited for his approval before she closed her eyes and cast her spell. Alyssa felt something stir, almost like an ephemeral wind, before Trish's body erupted into golden light. When it faded, her arm was entirely healed, and the bleeding had stopped. "Whoa," gasped Miguel, his eyes wide as saucers. "Magic." "Trish," said Alyssa, holstering her pistol. As she shoved her machete back in its sheath, she spat, "What the hell were you thinking? You saw a house that looked like a monster had torn through it, and you thought you should just traipse across the lawn without any sort of precautions. What the fuck were you thinking?" I don't know, I just thought I could help," she sobbed. "I didn't think there was a monster. Why would I think there was a monster? I just thought, I don't know what I thought." "You didn't think at all." Alyssa growled. "This isn't." "Enough," interrupted Roman, reaching out to grab her by the arm. "She knows that what she did was stupid, Alyssa. Just leave it. Nobody's hurt, so we can just—" Alyssa pulled away. She just wasted her spell. That means she can't use it again for a while. "It wasn't a waste," said Roman. "But it's done now. We can't undo it, so we just have to keep going." Alyssa clenched her fists in frustration. If they didn't take things seriously, they were all going to die. However, harping on Trish's mistake wasn't going to change anything. Hopefully, the woman had learned her lesson. Fine. But we need to do better. Agreed, Roman said, a steely glint in his eyes. He glanced at the pile of fur that had once been a monster, then asked, "So, what was that?" "Looked like a wolf," she said. "Sort of. Lots of things were wrong. Its snout's too short, the fur is all the wrong colors, and its legs are a little longer than normal. And it's the size of a pony," added Carmen, her hand on Miguel's shoulder. She wasn't going to let him get too far away, especially after what had just happened. That too. Carmen reached down to help Trish up, saying, "It's a monster. Doesn't matter where it came from. Maybe it's a wolf that got mutated." That wouldn't be that surprising, given the fact that Trish here just cast an honest-to-God healing spell. Or it could have been brought here from somewhere else. It might have just manifested for all we know. The point is that it doesn't matter for now. All we need to know is that the world just got a lot more dangerous, right? The people who lived there are probably dead too, Alyssa said, gesturing to the ruined house. If they're not, they ran away. No way they fought it off. You don't know that, Trish said, wiping her tears. She must have forgotten that she was coated in blood, because she left red smears across her cheeks. If they had fought it off, it would have been injured. And I'm pretty damn sure doors couldn't stop that thing. Hell, walls would barely slow it down, Alyssa stated. If they were still in that house, it would have killed them. Same with any other houses we see. Let's just go to the store, get what we need, then head back home. We can hole up there until... She let the statement trail off because the idea of rescue seemed absolutely ridiculous. The city was gone. If those notifications were to be believed, the whole world had been randomized. That meant the army wasn't coming. No, they were all alone, and if they wanted to survive, they needed to do so on their own. Perhaps someone would eventually come. The government still existed, after all. But Alyssa expected that it would be a long time before they got around to rescuing anyone. "What are you thinking?" asked Roman. "I don't think we should go back to the house," she said. "Not permanently, at least. We need somewhere more defensible." Roman didn't immediately respond. Carmen and Trish did, though. Neither were terribly supportive of the idea, but that wasn't surprising, given their personalities. Carmen was concerned with uprooting Miguel, while Trish still wasn't convinced they needed to move at all. Miguel, for his part, seemed excited about it. "Where?" asked Roman. "I don't know. Maybe the elementary school," she suggested. "Too open. The bank? Too small. The station?" was her next suggestion. Roman tapped his finger against his chin, then said, "You know what? That would probably work. It's got size. It's closer to the lake, so we would have an easier time getting water. And it's sturdier than any house." Indeed, the police station was made of brick, and it was a FEMA-approved shelter. That, plus the fact that it was equipped with a sturdy fence and a relatively huge arsenal of weapons, made it the perfect choice. "Plus, we kind of need to go there anyway," Roman said. "Once we're sure Trish and your family are safe, we need to start working on the rest of the town. The station's the best place to do that." "Sounds like a plan," Alyssa said. She wasn't nearly as concerned with her duty as she was with making certain that Carmen and Miguel were safe, but she hadn't abandoned it altogether. "Store first. Then back to the house to gather our other supplies. We probably need to spend the night there before heading out first thing in the morning." Roman nodded. For their part, the others only made minor objections. However, they were quickly convinced when Alyssa pointed at the house, reminding them that a monster had ripped its wall to pieces. After that, they fell into line. So, with that, the group continued down the street as they made their way to the grocery store. When they reached the market over an hour later, they found that more than a few people had already picked it clean. There were still some supplies to be had, but it was far less than any of them hoped. In the end, they had to be satisfied with one cart full of canned goods, another shopping cart filled with bottled water, and another with a variety of dry goods. Thus supplied, the group started back to the house, studiously ignoring the evidence of fighting they passed along the way. A few storefronts had been bashed in, and a couple of houses had taken even more damage than the one where they'd encountered the wolf monster. Still, they didn't see any other people, which they all found more than a little curious. Alyssa hoped that they were all just hiding, mostly because she didn't want to think about the alternative. Finally, they returned to the house, where they set about arranging everything they might need to take with them when they left for the station in the morning. Elijah looked down at his ruined legs. The crabs had really done a number on them, and unless he figured out how to use his new spell, he'd be in real trouble. Even if he'd managed to overcome his cancer, which was still unsure, he still had to concern himself with immediate survival. His legs were caked with dried blood and dirt, which didn't bode well for staving off infection. In addition, huge chunks of muscle were missing, snipped away and eaten by the oversized crustaceans. His legs had been so ravaged that he questioned whether he could even walk without the advantage of adrenaline pumping through his veins. He extended his hand and whispered, "Touch of nature." But nothing happened, which made him feel extremely foolish. After trying a few different techniques, most of which involved contorting his fingers in various ways, Elijah sagged back against the tree and closed his eyes. Now that he'd calmed down a little, he was beset by wave after wave of agony originating from his legs. There were smaller injuries across his body. The crabs hadn't confined themselves to a single place after all, but they were insignificant next to the fiery pain in his lower legs. There was something beyond the pain, something almost soothing, something comforting. He focused on that sensation, delving deeper and deeper until he finally recognized what he sensed. It was nature. He remembered the description that had come along with the Druid archetype, which had claimed that it included a bonus to one with nature. At the time, Elijah hadn't known what to expect from it, but now, leaning against that tree in the middle of a forest, he felt more at home than he'd ever felt before in his life. In the past, Elijah had been no stranger to the outdoors. As a child, he'd grown up camping and hiking with his parents, and he'd continued that positive relationship with nature when he'd chosen his career as a marine biologist. Often, during a hike or when he was sitting on a boat in the middle of the ocean, he'd found himself looking around in abject wonder and appreciation for the natural world. Sometimes, it was the result of gazing at a particularly vivid sunset, or seeing a mighty storm on the horizon, maybe overlooking a raging river that cut through a deep canyon. It had happened so many times that the scenes themselves tended to blend together. But the feeling remained. Now, it had been dialed up to 100, and as a result, he didn't just feel an appreciation for nature. Instead, it was a connection. He was no longer standing outside, a spectator looking in. Rather, he was a part of it. Another piece of the ecological puzzle. Simply put, he belonged. He let out a sigh, and for a long moment, Elijah simply basked in that feeling. It overwhelmed his pain, ushering it into the back of his mind. The agony was still there, but in the face of that overwhelming sense of belonging, it was a pitiful thing that barely even qualified as discomfort. Then, suddenly, that oneness with nature faded away, little by little, until it was only a vague awareness. A metaphysical anchor that kept him moored to the natural world. But more than that, it gave him some insight into his own being, which was divided into 4 distinct pieces. There was his physical body, weak but vibrant with potential. Then his mind, a snarl of errant thoughts and determination. His soul, an ephemeral web that suffused his entire body, almost like a second circulatory system but far more complex and infinitely more meaningful. The last piece drew his attention more than any other. At the center of who he was, there was a gleaming ball of energy. Physically, it was located in the center of his chest. Spiritually, it was at the intersection of his soul. Each pathway inevitably stemmed from that sphere of power, the thickest and most powerful of which ran to his mind. It was all connected, but that core was the driving force behind everything. So, he focused on it. A second later, he let out a ragged gasp. The energy contained in that core wasn't just overwhelming. It was domineering. But even the brief glimpse Elijah had managed told him that it was the key to everything. So, marshaling his willpower, he shoved his attention back into the core, keeping one thing on his mind. Touch of nature, he thought. When he did, a surge of power rushed through his soul. It built for a long second until, at last, it flowed into his hand. Elijah opened his eyes to see that his fingers glowed with a soft, verdant light. Trembling, Elijah reached out to touch the most egregious wound on his leg, where the crab had torn a 3-inch chunk of flesh from his calf. If he'd been capable of washing out the dirt, debris, and blood, he felt certain he would have seen bone. But when he touched the wound, the green light surged, blanketing it in a warm glow. Then, the flesh began to writhe, bits of muscle and skin growing out in tendrils until they connected with the other side. One after another, looking like fleshy string, they mended together, and as they did, they pushed the foreign substances out. But it wasn't easy. In fact, holding that concentration was one of the most difficult things Elijah had ever done. If it wasn't a matter of survival, he might not have managed it. However, it was so he did, keeping the energy, the system called Ethera, flowing through his soul and into his mind, which somehow converted it into the spell. After a few moments, he couldn't hold it anymore, and with a gasp, his core sputtered and the Ethera ran dry. Still, when he looked down at his leg, he saw mostly unbroken skin where the wound had once been. There were plenty more up and down his calves and on his feet, but in mere moments, he'd managed to completely heal a wound that should have taken weeks to mend. Elijah sighed in relief and sagged against the tree. Its presence was comforting, like an old friend who'd wrapped him in its warm embrace. For a moment, Elijah considered simply giving in to his exhaustion and closing his eyes. However, it only took the memory of waking up to being eaten by giant crabs to disabuse him of that notion. So, he sat there, regulating his breathing as he concentrated on his core. Slowly, it refilled, but it didn't generate the Ethera itself. Instead, Elijah's mind seemed to have become a funnel, absorbing the energy from the environment and channeling it through his soul down to his core. The key seemed to be keeping his mind clear, otherwise, he could sense the rate of recovery slow to a crawl. Overall, it took almost 10 minutes for him to refill his Ethera reserves. Once his core was full, he repeated the process on his other wounds, stopping only when he ran dry of Ethera. It took most of the rest of the day, but by the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Elijah was healthier than he'd been in months. He was still weak, remarkably so, but he didn't feel sick or injured. He couldn't be certain if the cancer was actually gone, but he felt well enough that it gave him some hope for the future. Perhaps he wasn't going to die, after all. Not immediately, at least. But the fact of the matter was that, even if he was healthy, he was still stranded in the wilderness, alone and with no supplies. And if the size of those crabs was any indication of what to expect, the wildlife had been affected by whatever had turned the world upside down as well. It wasn't outside the realm of possibility that things were much more dangerous now than they had been when he'd left Hawaii. Even so, there was cause for optimism. He was still weak, but he'd just used an actual magic spell to heal wounds that should have been crippling in his current environment. Without touch of nature, those wounds would have soon gotten infected, and, given the state of his immune system, he would have succumbed not long after that. Now, though, he had a new lease on life, and he wasn't going to waste it. So, he gathered all the knowledge he'd managed to compile over decades of camping and hiking, and he began to make a list of what he needed to do if he was going to survive for longer than a couple of days. The first thing he did was check his pockets for his phone, which proved completely unfruitful. It must have fallen out when he'd hit the water. Or while floating in the ocean, perhaps. It wasn't unexpected, but still, the inability to simply call for rescue was disappointing. In any case, he moved on to the other necessities for survival. First, he needed water. Then shelter, fire, and finally food. Luckily, the biome seemed to suggest that he was still in the Pacific Northwest, which meant that water should be plentiful. Shelter might be a little more difficult to find, but given the time of year, food should be abundant. Sure, mushrooms and berries weren't always appetizing, but they would sustain him until he could find something else. Fire would be the most difficult, especially without specialized tools like a ferro rod or a lighter. Even so, he'd made fires from scratch before, and though the environment was incredibly wet, there were places in the Pacific Northwest that were classified as actual rainforests. He hoped he could put those long-dormant skills to good use. For now, though, Elijah needed to explore his surroundings to see if he could find a ready source of fresh water. So, after inspecting himself for wounds one more time, he pushed himself to his feet. The surge of energy he felt upon standing was enough to make him stumble, and he pressed one hand to the pine tree, steadying himself. He just wasn't used to feeling good. If anything, that highlighted how adaptable people could really be, that he'd managed to keep going for as long as he had. But now, he didn't have to worry about that. He hoped. With a sigh, Elijah shook his head, reminding himself that he didn't have much choice in the matter. Before, he'd been completely incapable of changing his fate. The cancer was terminal, and he'd accepted his death as inevitable. However, now that it seemed to be gone, or at least weakened enough that he'd been given a fighting chance, he felt free. But it was all an illusion. If it still decided to kill him, there was still nothing he could do about it. So, he chose to focus on the things he could affect, mainly the items on his list. After taking a deep, steadying breath, he pushed away from the tree and trekked inland. It was slow going, mostly due to the density of the forest, but Elijah was an old hand at picking his way through the wilds. So, he made gradual progress until the sound of a stream filled his ears. By that point, the forest had descended into dusk, which made finding shelter almost as much of a priority as finding water to quench his thirst. Still, he trudged forward until he stumbled onto a small stream. It was only a few feet across, but it flowed extremely quickly across the rocks that made up the streambed. Elijah collapsed next to the water, cupping his hands and taking a big gulp. He knew he should have taken the time to boil it, but he was hoping that the combination of his high constitution and the healing power of Touch of Nature would be a match for any sickness that came from the microbes in the water. Regardless, he didn't have much choice in the matter. Every piece of wood he'd seen during his trek through the forest had been soaked through by the incessant humidity and the frequent drizzling rain, meaning that he'd have to get lucky if he wanted to start a proper fire. After drinking his fill, Elijah sat back and focused on the sense of one with nature, and he was surprised to find that it was subtly different than it had been closer to the shore. Stronger in some ways, but gentler too. It was as if there was some sort of calming presence watching over the area. And he got the impression that it would be stronger the further inland he traveled. As curious as Elijah was, though, he was in no shape to investigate. Night was on its way, and he needed to find some sort of shelter before that happened. Being alone in the wilderness in the dark was one thing, but trying to sleep in the rain was even worse. So, he reluctantly pushed himself back to his feet and followed the stream uphill. As he did so, Elijah continued to look for a hollow or an overhang that might prove to be decent shelter for the night. But to his eternal surprise and good fortune, only 20 minutes later, he found himself staring at something wholly unexpected in such rugged country. It was a cabin. It was old, decrepit, and the roof looked on the verge of collapse. But soaked through, tired, and with night nipping at Elijah's heels, the cabin looked like a godsend. He ambled forward, tripping over a root along the way, but he maintained his balance until he reached the wall. The cabin itself had been constructed of a series of horizontal logs, with the gaps filled in with mud. The roof was of similar construction, but a layer of moss and leaves would provide insulation. A metal tube, rusted and barely holding together, extended from one of the walls, and Elijah reasoned that it must be the cabin's chimney. "Hello," he called, sure that he was wasting his time. The cabin was in too poor of shape to have housed anyone in a long while. That impression was further cemented in Elijah's mind when he began to circle around the structure, and he saw that half of it had, indeed, collapsed long ago. He shook his head, wondering what had happened. How old was the cabin? Why hadn't the owner fixed it? Where were they now? 100 similar questions raced through Elijah's thoughts, but there were no answers forthcoming. So, he carefully climbed over the debris, making certain not to impale his bare feet on anything particularly sharp, and looked around inside. There wasn't much there. An old pot that might be good for boiling water or, eventually, cooking. A rusted knife that didn't look sharp enough to do anything with. And the remains of some rotted furniture. Altogether, it wasn't much better than if he'd found a cave. But for now, it would have to do. Tomorrow, he'd have to find food and a better place to sleep so he could regain his strength and prepare for whatever came next. He still hadn't decided if he wanted to continue his trek inland to look for civilization or if he wanted to stay put and wait for rescue. There were merits in favor of either course of action. On the one hand, most survival guides would have told him to stay where he was and wait for rescue. There were plenty of exceptions to that rule, though, and in any case, everything he'd seen on that plane suggested that the world had experienced significant upheaval. It would be a bit naive to expect someone to rescue him. But as Elijah settled down in the most intact corner of the cabin, curling up, he decided that that was a decision better made after a good night's rest. After a night filled with fitful sleep, Elijah woke to a world of pain twisting through his stomach. He clutched at his midsection and, as cramps assailed him, heaved the meager contents of his stomach onto the ground beside him. There was precious little there, mostly liquid in fact, which gave him some clues as to what had happened. The water he'd drunk the evening before had obviously been contaminated. Stupid, he muttered, thinking back to his decision to drink the water without even trying to boil it. But in his defense, he didn't really have the means to start a fire. And until he'd found the cabin, he hadn't had anything in which to boil any water he managed to collect. For a healthy person, the tainted water might not have been that impactful, but his immune system had been devastated by the deadly combination of cancer, chemotherapy, and radiation, and despite the effects of his increased attributes, he clearly wasn't fully recovered. Once his stomach stopped twisting and turning, Elijah sat up and closed his eyes. The pain was still there, but he needed to move past it. He had plenty of experience in that arena, what with everything he'd been through while fighting his disease, so it wasn't that difficult to concentrate on the ball of energy in his chest. With an effort of will, he mentally embraced the Ethera in his core, grasping at it with his consciousness. The shock was like dunking his entire mind in frigid water. Or molten lava. It was difficult to tell the difference, the feeling was so intense. However, he pushed past that shock, wrapped his core in his willpower and pulled. As he did so, he muttered, "Touch of nature." His hand lit up with verdant energy, and when he laid it on his rebellious stomach, the spell flowed forth and back into his body. For only an instant, Elijah could follow its path, but soon it left his perception behind. However, a few seconds later, he felt the spell take hold as it healed the damage inflicted by whatever parasite had twisted his stomach into knots. The spell only lasted for a few moments, but by the time the green energy dissipated, Elijah felt better than he had since before being diagnosed. He wasn't so naive as to think that his little spell could cure cancer. Based on how long it had taken to heal his legs, he suspected that it didn't have nearly enough power to do that. Instead, it felt like confirmation that the attribute points that he'd allocated into Constitution had been well spent. Was he cured? He had no idea, but he intended to investigate it further. Even if he hadn't been completely healed, he'd made progress. And for now, that was enough to give him a jolt of optimism and energy. So, with streams of morning sunlight cutting through the forest's dense canopy, Elijah pushed himself to his feet and stretched aching muscles. Whatever benefits he'd gotten from touch of nature, it had done nothing to counteract the effects of sleeping in such an uncomfortable position. Not that he would complain too much. Not only was he alive, but he had access to magic. Plus, there was still that slight tingle in the air giving him a trickle of energy and a sense of belonging. He didn't quite feel at home, but he wasn't nearly as distressed as being stranded in the wilderness should have made him. After a few minutes of stretching, Elijah thought back to the simple list of things he wanted to accomplish. The first part was to catalog everything he'd found in the ruined cabin. It was all trash, but in the wilderness, even garbage could be useful. A rusted knife, a pot, and a few piles of wood. There was also a coil of rope, but it was so rotted that he wouldn't trust it to hold even the meager weight of his cancer-ravaged body. Overall, it wasn't much, but it was better than he could have expected. The pot, in particular, would be incredibly useful when he managed to start a fire. Clutching the rusted knife in his hand, he arduously hacked off the shredded hems of his pants, carefully putting the cloth in his pockets where he hoped they would dry into decent tinder. It wasn't a great idea, but everything else in the forest was perpetually damp. He had some other thoughts on how to get around that, but for now, he would take the steps he could and hope for better luck in the future. With that done, he scoured the area around the cabin for a walking stick. Fortunately, a storm had come through sometime in the past few days, breaking plenty of limbs. So, Elijah had no difficulty finding a stout, mostly straight branch that could serve as both a walking stick and a means of protection from any nearby predators. Of course, he didn't think he was going to fight them off. The best he could hope for was to use the stick to establish some distance before he ran away. As he'd searched through the forest, though, Elijah got the distinct sensation that he was being watched. However, no matter how often or how quickly he turned, he saw nothing. Perhaps it was only his imagination playing tricks on him. Or maybe some apex predator who'd been transformed alongside the rest of the planet was stalking him. He shuddered at the thought. There were plenty of predators native to the Pacific Northwest. From bears to wolves and everything in between, they were dangerous enough before the influx of Ethera had transformed the planet. But if they'd been affected like the crabs? The last thing Elijah wanted to run into was a van-sized brown bear. Regardless, he didn't have much of a choice in the matter. If he was going to live, or maybe even thrive, he couldn't just stay huddled in that ruined cabin. He needed kindling. He needed firewood and food. Otherwise, he might as well lay down and die. So, marshaling his courage, Elijah set off into the woods. All the while, sticks and rocks stabbed him in the feet, but he ignored the discomfort. None of it drew blood, and he could always use touch of nature to heal any damage at the end of the day. As he walked, he kept an eye out for reasonably dry sticks, picking them up when he stumbled upon them. He also kept a lookout for birch trees, hoping to use their bark for tinder. On that account, he was unlucky. Still, he was fortunate enough to find some red bunchberries and a huge chanterelle mushroom. Elijah used the front of his shirt to carry them as he continued his exploration. That same feeling of being watched followed him through the forest until he finally broke free from the brush and into a wide meadow. The clearing was about 200 yards long and about half again as wide, but it was completely clear, save for a single huge oak tree that towered hundreds of feet into the sky. However, as impressive as that sight was, Elijah was more concerned with the wispy, white dandelions dotting the small prairie. He couldn't help but smile as he realized that he'd found his tinder. It wasn't perfect, and he'd have to gather hundreds of the cottony white seeds, but there were plenty available. Gleefully, he crossed the meadow and began collecting his bounty, shoving the seeds into one of his pockets. His happiness at finding such a ready supply of tinder was so intoxicating that he almost didn't notice that the feeling of belonging that had suffused the entire forest had only grown stronger. But once he did, he immediately knew the source. He looked up at the tree towering over the meadow. It called to him, and before Elijah realized what was happening, he found himself stumbling across the meadow. When he reached the tree, he extended a trembling hand and laid it on the rough bark of its trunk. A soothing sensation filled Elijah's entire body. Suddenly, his muscles relaxed. His mind cleared, and the fatigue that had been building from the moment he'd woken up fell away. Then he felt a presence. "Hello," came a high-pitched voice. Elijah jerked his head up, and he saw something growing out of the lowest branch. At first, he thought it was just another limb, gnarled as it was. However, as he looked closer, he saw that it had taken the shape of a tiny, 6-inch tall person. That person, though, was made entirely of branches that had grown together. It had no defining features, and one of its wooden hands clutched at the trunk. "Did I startle you?" asked the tree creature. "No," Elijah said, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "What? I mean, who are you?" The creature cocked its head to the side as if thinking about Elijah's question. Then, after a few seconds, it said, "I am the tree, and the tree is me. I only took this form so I could communicate with you. But, not that I'm ungrateful," Elijah said. "It's just that I've never spoken to a tree before." "A druid who does not speak to trees?" "How?" it said. Then, it leaned forward, never taking its arm from the trunk. "Ah, I see. You are very weak. New to power. Understandable. But this will not do. My protector cannot be so weak." "Protector?" "Indeed," said the tree. "You are a druid, and this is your grove. Therefore, you must protect me." Elijah had no idea what to say to that. In fact, the whole encounter was so strange and unbelievable that he was unsure what to even think. "I have decided to help you." "What? How?" he asked. "Information," the tree said. "Now sit. I will guide you to your first breakthrough. It is not much, but it will give you a better chance of survival." "Breakthrough? What kind of breakthrough?" he asked, cursing his own ignorance. He didn't know anything about the new form the world had taken, and that lack was going to get him killed. So, he decided to wring as much information from the tree as was possible. "Cultivation, of course," said the tree creature. Somehow, even without any facial features, Elijah felt like the thing regarded him as something of an idiot. I have no idea what that means, he said. I saw it on my status sheet, but… Heavenly status, said the tree. My heavenly status, then, Elijah corrected himself. Anyway, I don't know if you realize it, but this world just got, I don't know, transformed, and there's no manual or anything to tell me what's going on. A newly integrated world? The tree said. Of course. Now I remember. That is why the Ethera is so thin. It makes perfect sense. The tree creature sat down on the branch, then cupped its chin in one hand. So, you know nothing of the system? That is both a boon and a curse, it said. You have an opportunity to grow very powerful, but with that power will come responsibilities. It looked up. If you survive, of course. Elijah swallowed hard. He'd already surmised that the new world would be dangerous. If he had magic, then surely others would as well. And judging by what had happened with the crabs, the wildlife would be affected as well. I'll do whatever it takes, Elijah stated. He'd made peace with his impending death, but that didn't mean he intended to lie down and give up. He felt like he had a new lease on life, and he wasn't going to let it go without doing whatever he could. Very well, said the tree creature, sounding pleased. But I am limited in how much information I can convey. The system does not prohibit charity, but there is an established system whereby newly integrated worlds can gain knowledge. I'll take whatever I can get. Yes. You have some spirit in you, the tree said. With how weak your body is, you will need that. In fact, I think that is where we will start. You want to heal me? I've been sick for a while and… And yes, the tree stated. It is more complicated than that. Think of it more as I will be guiding you towards the tools that will allow you to heal yourself. Like touch of nature, Elijah reasoned. With cultivation. You keep saying that word like I should know what it means, Elijah countered. But if you want me to plant something and help it grow, I'm not sure I have the tools or the tree sighed, a sound like wind whistling through its branches. Or perhaps the wind really was rustling its leaves. Elijah wasn't sure, and he didn't have much opportunity to figure it out because the tree said, cultivation is a system whereby a sentient being improves themselves. There are 4 categories: body, mind, core, and soul. They are intertwined but separate, dependent on one another, but capable of progressing independently. The tree went on, your body is the easiest, but in your situation, it will be the most impactful. Without it, you will likely die within a month or 2. The cancer? The disease? I cannot sense any other specifics. Elijah shook his head. So, his efforts at raising his constitution attribute had been wasted, and the resultant spike of energy was unrelated. He hadn't been healed at all. It wasn't really unprecedented. There had been times after his diagnosis when Elijah had almost felt normal. Usually, those moments were brief, and they usually coincided with distractions. Now, he realized that the plane crash and all the changes he had experienced had probably caused such a moment. What do the others do? He asked. Your mind dictates how quickly you can funnel Ethera into your soul, it said. Together with your regeneration attribute, it determines how quickly you can refill your stores of Ethera. Then there is your soul, which determines how quickly you can bring that Ethera to bear via spells, abilities, and skills. It went on, but the core is the most important aspect of your cultivation. At its most basic level, it is where you store your Ethera, and when you cultivate it, you increase the potency of your Ethera. However, it will also influence your entire path, which is arguably more important. Why don't we improve that one then? Elijah asked. Because you are not ready, the tree said. In addition, without advancing your body cultivation, you will surely die, regardless of the stage of your core. And finally, it requires more than this world is currently capable of providing. But what? To tell you more than that would be to risk the ire of the system, the tree stated. For now, all I can do is put you on the path. Learn this lesson well, because your life will depend on it. I understand. Good, the tree said. Now let us begin. Alyssa knelt in the park across the street from the police station. Next to her was Roman, with the other 3 a few feet behind. She asked, "What do you think?" "It's not good," he said, clutching his bow. Alyssa noticed that his knuckles were white, and if she was honest, she didn't blame him even a little. On their way through town, They'd seen plenty of evidence that the world, as they knew it, was gone. They'd even had to fight a couple of battles, though with Alyssa's heavy blows-empowered machete and Roman's bow skills, none of the mutated creatures had lasted long. Thankfully, they hadn't seen anything like that first wolf monster they'd encountered. "Do you think it's another wolf?" she asked, still studying the shattered glass of the front door. "Or something worse? Maybe one of those huge raccoons?" "I don't know," he admitted, running his hand through his hair. He looked as bad as Alyssa felt. Just like her, he took the little town's safety as his personal responsibility, and they'd seen plenty of evidence of just how thoroughly they'd failed in that endeavor. Not that they could have predicted that the world would be transformed overnight, but still, it hit them both extremely hard. Especially when they'd seen the bodies. So far, there had only been a few, and they were so chewed up that they were unrecognizable. Even so, no one in their little group had been unaffected. Alyssa rested her hand on the grip of her pistol. Not because she thought it would do much good. If nothing else, the trip across town had proven just how ineffective firearms were against the transformed creatures. Even the raccoons, which seemed to be the weakest monsters they'd encountered, took an entire magazine to put down. The machete at her hip had proven a much more reliable weapon. The same was true of Roman's bow. Even Carmen's shotgun, which she'd gotten from the gun safe in their basement, hadn't done much, and she'd been forced to fight with the old softball bat. It hadn't lasted long, and she'd replaced it with a solid steel crowbar which, with her strength, was devastating. The one who'd taken it worst was Trish. She was a nice enough woman, but she just wasn't built for the apocalypse. Prone to panic and incapable of acting in a crisis, she was more of a liability than an asset. Even her ability to heal couldn't change that. By comparison, Miguel was taking the end of the world remarkably well. Certainly he was frightened. What 8-year-old wouldn't be? But he'd proven his mother's son, and he'd responded to the dire situation by searching for ways to make himself useful. At present, he was the group's pack mule, carrying extra ammunition and a few bottles of water. Their other supplies were in shopping carts they'd taken from the market. "We're going to have to go in soon," Alyssa said, glancing at the sky. The sun was almost to the horizon, which meant night would soon be upon them. None of them wanted to be outside after sunset, which meant they needed to clear the station out, then secure it so they could hole up for the night. In the morning, they would establish more permanent defenses. "I know," Roman stated, shaking his head. "I don't like it. There's something in there." "I know it. Does that change anything?" Alyssa asked. "We can't go back." Indeed, the house was miles away, and it would take at least 20 minutes to reach any other building that might offer any security. "I'm aware. I'm just not looking forward to what we have to do." "That's fair. Where do you think everyone else is?" he asked. They'd only seen a few townspeople along the way, and none of them seemed keen on doing anything but barricading themselves in their houses. Even when Alyssa had offered to protect them, they'd remained silent. Not for the first time, she recognized that being a police officer didn't exactly engender trust. The relationship between law enforcement and the general populace had been shattered, and it seemed that the end of the world hadn't changed that. Alyssa shrugged. "I don't think it's healthy to think about that right now," she said. "Okay, so here's what I'm thinking. I'll run in there and—" "By yourself?" "No chance. Just listen, all right? I'll run in there. I got that new ability," she said. Indeed, she'd gained a level along the way, and it had granted her a new ability. Dash forward at 200% your normal speed for 3 seconds. Your next attack will do 30% more damage. I can go in, see what's in there, and if I get in trouble, I'll use charge, she said. That way, I can lead them out here, where you'll be waiting to fill them full of arrows. It sounds dangerous. More than taking Trish and Miggy in there? She asked. Because I don't know about you, but I have no intention of letting my son in that building until I know for sure there aren't any monsters. Too much can go wrong in an enclosed space. If keeping him safe means I have to take on a little more, then so be it. Alyssa had worked with Roman for almost 5 years, so she knew him well enough to recognize the sour expression for what it was. He didn't like the plan, but he also had no alternative proposal. The reality was that the trip across town had taken a lot longer than any of them could have anticipated, and now, they were overextended. With night coming, they didn't have a lot of choices. We could go back to the bank, he said. It's less than a mile away. There are probably monsters there too. You saw that hole in the front window, Alyssa reminded him. Indeed, they'd only passed a couple of buildings that hadn't been breached, and none that were close enough to reach before dark. You know I'm right, Chief. This is the best option. Besides, you can set that new ability of yours up, too. I don't trust it, he muttered. Embrace the magic, Chief, she said, forcing a grin she didn't really feel. That's all we can do at this point. Alyssa understood his reservations. It was one thing to use something like heavy blows, which just made her better at something she was already doing. But to manifest a trap out of nothing? That was enough to hammer home just how much things had changed. Sure, the monsters did the same, but it required a different sort of response than being able to use magic. Or Ethera, as every notification seemed to remind them. In Roman's case, his second ability, or spell as it was categorized, let him set a magical trap that hobbled any hostile creature that passed through. The effect didn't last more than a few seconds, but the one time they tested it, the spell had worked extremely well. How it differentiated between enemies and allies was still a mystery, but it managed it all the same. Let's do it then. Daylight's burning, he said, replacing his cap. Probably should let them know the plan, Alyssa said, nodding to the other three. They were far enough away that they had been incapable of hearing the exchange. I'll take care of it, Roman stated. You need to get moving. We'll be ready when you come out. All right. With that, Alyssa stood, then looked back at Carmen. She nodded at her wife before taking a deep breath and turning toward the station. She and Roman strode forward together, but he didn't pass through the door. Instead, he knelt before it, holding his hands out and casting his spell. Meanwhile, Alyssa stepped into the lobby, holding her machete in one hand and the pistol in the other. If everything went according to plan, she wouldn't need either. Not inside the building, at least. Outside was a different story, and she didn't want to think about the immediate future. It was a tension she couldn't spare. So, she crept through the familiar lobby, passing the receptionist's desk and into the office space. There, she saw 10 desks, each sporting a computer monitor. Beyond was an interrogation room, a break room, and a couple of storage closets. On the other side stood the chief's office. Alyssa stepped softly, keeping her breathing as even as she could. It had been a long time since she'd hunted, but she hadn't forgotten the lessons her father had taught her. Sure, Elijah had always been the more skilled outdoorsman, but Alyssa hadn't lagged too far behind. So, she channeled those skills as she cleared the area, finding nothing. Next, she checked the outer rooms, finding more of the same. Which was to say, nothing. In fact, Alyssa was starting to think that, perhaps, whatever had broken into the station had already abandoned it. But she knew better. Besides, there was still one level left to clear. The basement held the holding cells as well as the armory, which meant that there was plenty of space downstairs to hold any number of horrors. So, after taking another deep breath, Alyssa approached the stairs. Opening the door, she poked her head inside. And nearly gagged. There, sprawled across the floor, was a half-eaten corpse that had once been one of her colleagues. By his skin tone, it was Jerome, one of the other deputies. Alyssa didn't need to check for a pulse to know he was dead. Not only was he completely stationary, but he was missing a third of his torso. Nobody could live through that. Still, after making certain that nothing was going to jump out and try to eat her, she knelt beside him and collected the magazines at his belt. Ammunition would soon grow scarce, and there was every chance that she would soon need it. After all, whatever had killed Jerome was probably still around. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Alyssa continued down the stairs. Notably, Jerome had clearly tried to climb to safety, as evidenced by trail of blood-soaked stairs. Alyssa ignored them, instead focusing on her surroundings. Which was a good thing, because as she hit the staircase's switchback, something launched itself at her. But it didn't come from below. Instead, it descended from the low ceiling, spreading bat-like wings as it snapped at her with slavering jaws. With so much adrenaline coursing through her veins, she responded with incredible alacrity, slashing out with her machete. The monster, and it could be nothing else, screeched as the blade bit deep into its furry body. But it still got its claws into her forearm. Alyssa screamed as she tried to dislodge it, banging the monster against the wall. Yet, Despite her frantic efforts, it held fast. So, she jammed the pistol against its bulbous body, then squeezed the trigger. The weapon discharged with an ear-splitting and unmistakable crack, which was soon followed by another. And another after that. The monster went wild as she emptied the entire magazine into the creature. Blood and fur misted into the air, but it held on until the very end. Finally, after she discharged every single round into monster, Alyssa banged it against the wall. Over and over until, at last, its screeches became burbling wheezes. Then at last it fell free. Alyssa stared at it for a long moment, unsure of what she saw. The monster was bat-like, but with humanoid characteristics. Especially its face, which looked almost simian. But she didn't have time to study it, because the sound of a dozen flapping wings filled the air as more monsters ascended from below. Alyssa didn't hesitate to turn and run. She'd gotten the creature's attention. Now, she just needed to lead them outside where, hopefully, her allies could finish them off. That was easier said than done, though, largely because she had a flock of monkey bats trying to kill her. Dashing up the stairs, she had to duck under one such monster, then lash out with her machete to knock another out of her way before she could get through the door. Once she'd made it through, she used charge. Instantly, her body responded. Alyssa had run track in college, so she'd always been relatively fast. But the speed she achieved after using charge was something else altogether. If she ran any less than 35 miles an hour, she would have been incredibly surprised. However, that speed came with a cost, chiefly, that she had difficulty changing direction. For a few steps, she was fine, but then she clipped one of the desks, which sent her spinning. With so much momentum, that spin took her into one of the walls, where she caromed into another desk. But she still kept moving forward, eventually stumbling into the lobby and through the door. The bat monkeys weren't far behind. Charge dissipated, and she tumbled to the ground. She tried to turn it into a roll, but her movements were graceless, and she ended up sprawled across the pavement of the parking lot. Behind her, the bat monkeys screeched, the sound accompanied by the steady thwop of Roman's bow. Meanwhile, Alyssa heard Carmen let out an inarticulate yell, and when she finally righted herself, she saw the stout woman swinging her crowbar at the disoriented and slowed bat monkeys. In the waning light, they looked like true monsters, largely because there was no way anything like them had ever existed on Earth. But with Carmen's incredible strength and Roman's steady aim, the flock of creatures soon fell. Vaguely, Alyssa was aware of someone kneeling beside her. Trish reached out and used her mend spell. Vitality flooded through Alyssa's body as her wounds closed. Instantly, her mind snapped into focus, but it was unnecessary. The monsters were all dead. Roman and Carmen rushed over, and from somewhere, Miguel appeared with a bottle of water. Alyssa looked up and said, "That definitely didn't go like I planned." "You think?" "God, you're an idiot," groused Carmen. "Idiot is a bad word," Miguel offered. "I know, sweetie," said Carmen, tousling his hair. "But sometimes, bad words are appropriate. Is it clear?" Roman asked. "I think so," Alyssa answered, pushing herself to her feet. Despite the healing, she was still a little unsteady. "I saw Jerome. He didn't make it?" "Shit. He was a good man," Roman stated. He sighed. "He won't be the last, though. Let's get inside and find something to block the door." And with that, the group grabbed their carts full of supplies and headed into the station. Hopefully, it would prove more secure for them than it had been for poor Jerome. "What do I call you?" asked Elijah, still looking up at the tree creature. "I have no name, for I am only a sapling," it said. "Regardless, this is the last time we will speak for some time. I am nearly at the end of my available energy." Oh, Elijah had no idea how to respond to that, so he decided to keep his mouth shut. As his father always said, it was better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. It had originally been an Abraham Lincoln quote, but Elijah's father had adopted it as a mantra. Elijah missed the days he'd spent with his father. Most of the time, they didn't even talk. Instead, they'd just sit in nature and enjoy one another's silent company. By contrast, his mother had been the talkative type whose base demeanor bordered on mania. She could be exhausting, but her good-natured attitude and kind heart had made it endearing, rather than annoying. Everything would have been so much easier to bear if they were still around. But fate had other ideas, and almost a decade passed, they died in a brutal car crash. Back then, Elijah had just graduated high school, but he remembered it like it was yesterday. He shook his head. It was neither the time nor the place to think about such things. If the tree creature was running low on energy, then its time was limited. Elijah needed to get as much information out of it as he could manage. So, he looked up and asked, "So, what do I do?" "Sit," said the tree. Elijah did, crossing his legs under him. The tree was surrounded by a carpet of green and yellow moss that had felt particularly luxurious on his sore feet. Sitting atop it was even better, and he found himself relaxing. Or perhaps that was just the tree's presence, which had put him at ease the moment he'd laid eyes on it. "Put your hands on your knees," it said. "Then close your eyes." Elijah followed the tree's instructions, feeling a bit silly. He'd tried meditation a few times, but he'd never achieved anything close to a quieted mind. Still, he'd tried it enough that he could recognize the trappings. With his eyes closed, Elijah could feel everything even more clearly. That pull he'd felt back in the cabin was even more potent now, telling him that it had originated with the tree. However, he also felt a sense of connection that he couldn't quite wrap his head around. Like he was part of something far bigger and more complex than he could understand. But rather than feel overwhelmed by that reality, he instead felt immense comfort. It was as if all he had to do was just let go, and he could throw away his individuality in favor of, "Listen to me, young one. Hear my voice," thundered the tree with far more volume and authority than it had before. "Do not surrender." It took a few more moments for Elijah to latch onto the tree's continuous instructions, but when he did, he felt overwhelmed with what he'd been about to do. In seconds, he'd nearly given up on everything that made him an individual. "The call is strong here," said the tree, its voice far gentler. "That you can resist it at all is a testament to your individualistic nature." "The call?" asked Elijah. "Of nature," the tree stated. "Of the collective. We call her the mother of all. But that is your first lesson, young Druid. To become one with the mother is tempting. It will feel natural. But that is not our path. You must resist or you will lose yourself. Do you understand? Do not surrender." I understand," was Elijah's response. And he did. He was horrified that it had only taken him a few seconds before he almost willingly sacrificed his individuality in favor of joining with the mother. "You must feel her presence," it said. "But you must not let it overwhelm you. Try." Elijah focused on that feeling, keeping a firm grip on his own identity. It was difficult, and it took quite a while, but with every breath, he let himself more fully perceive the energy surrounding him. In his mind's eye, it was green, but that was just a construct of his imagination. Still, it helped. For a while, it continued to try to convince him to surrender, but now that he was aware, he could resist the call. Barely. However, with every passing moment, it was a little easier. "Now, look closer," the tree intoned. "Separate the call from the Ethera." Elijah followed the tree's instructions. For a long time, he didn't even know what he was looking for, but as the minutes passed into hours, he began to recognize a subtle difference between the energy and the presence of the mother. It still felt like her, but it was separate, completely different from the Ethera in his core. "I see it," Elijah said, completely unaware of the sweat pouring down his hairless face. In fact, he was so deeply enmeshed in his trance that he could barely perceive the passage of time. "Could reach out with your awareness and drag the Ethera toward you," said the tree. "But do not absorb it through your mind. Surround yourself with it." That was much more difficult. Elijah could barely even follow what the energy was doing when his mind harvested it from the air and funneled it down into his core. When he'd done it before, most of the process was automated, he just had to give it a nudge. But interrupting that process and forcing the energy to do something else? That was extraordinarily difficult. Still, Elijah bent his will to doing just that, concentrating the entirety of his being on keeping the ambient Ethera from entering through the vortex in his mind. In the end, his will acted as a one-way door, letting the suction of the funnel act on the Ethera but not letting anything through. Hour after hour passed, but he didn't let up. Eventually, the gathered Ethera began to pool around him, growing ever denser as it clung to his body. One layer after another, It condensed further and further until Elijah could hardly breathe. He pushed harder, packing the energy around him until it had become a cocoon of Ethera. "Hold it there," said the tree, a note of strain in its voice. Elijah complied, focusing every ounce of his will on keeping the energy as densely packed as he could. And then an avalanche of Ethera crashed into him. He almost lost control as the pressure built far past what he could handle. But the new onslaught of energy was more controlled. "Now, condense it," roared the tree, its voice so powerful that it sent reverberations throughout Elijah's body. "Focus your will on harnessing the Ethera and compacting it into your body." Elijah pulled with his will, focusing on the tree's instructions. He didn't stop to wonder how he was doing any of it. Indeed, if he had, he would have felt like he'd gone insane. Or perhaps that he was concussed. But he didn't have any room for such thoughts in his mind. He could only do as the tree ordered. Even so, he almost lost his grip when his entire body erupted into agony. It was as if he'd descended thousands of feet underwater without any protective gear. The human body just wasn't meant to withstand that kind of pressure, and it felt like he was on the verge of implosion. His bones creaked, and his organs felt like they were about to rupture. If he could have stopped it, he would have. But the Ethera had taken on a mind of its own, increasing the pressure exponentially with every passing second. Elijah tried to scream, but he couldn't open his mouth. And even if he could, there was no air in his lungs. He was dying. He knew it. The tree had tricked him into willingly walking to his own doom. But Elijah didn't have the willpower left to curse his own naivete. Eventually, the pressure leveled out, but that was little relief for Elijah. He couldn't move. He could scarcely think, much less try to break free as the Ethera began to solidify around him. In the beginning, it felt like a dense fog, but then it was like being submerged in water that, in turn, became gelatinous. At some point, it turned completely solid, then crystalline, where it settled. Elijah wanted to scream, to rail against his captor. But he couldn't marshal the willpower, and even if he could, he was frozen in place. He could only await his fate. Like that, time passed. It could have been hours, days, months, or even years. Perhaps he would sit there, trapped in that crystalline prison for all eternity. And then, suddenly, there was a cracking sound, followed by the sensation of immense power washing through him. Another crack, and then another. Over and over, tiny fissures appeared in the crystal. Elijah still couldn't open his eyes, but he could feel tiny surges of relief with each crack. Then, finally, the crystal shattered, and he fell over, gasping for breath. That's when the smell hit him. It was like rotten garbage and sewage rolled into one horrible odor. Lying on his side, he retched, but only a little water came out. Coughing, he pushed himself to his hands and knees. Hanging his head, he muttered, What did you do to me?" "Nothing," said the tree. "I merely provided a little push. You did this to yourself. That is how cultivating the body works." Elijah slowly sat up, shifting away from the tiny puddle of vomit. However, when he looked down at the blanket of moss that had surrounded the huge tree, he was distressed to see that the once green and yellow carpet had become black and shriveled, almost as if the life had been sucked out of them. Then he looked at his hands, which were covered in a black, tar-like substance. As distressing as that was, he was more concerned with the state of his fingers. Over the course of his chemotherapy, his body had been ravaged by the toxic chemicals, but the most troubling side effect was when he'd started to lose his fingernails. His toenails had soon followed, but by that point he had been distracted by other, more pressing issues. Now, though, his nails had returned, and what's more, the skin he saw beneath the tar-like substance had lost the pallid, sickly complexion that had been with him for months. In its place was healthy skin. "What happened?" he asked, confused. He'd thought the tree had been trying to kill him. Or perhaps, to feed off of him in some way. But now, he wasn't so sure. "You have broken through to the first stage of body cultivation," the tree said. "You will be stronger, faster, more durable, and healthier than you've ever been before. That substance covering you is impurity made manifest and purged from your body. Whatever disease from which you suffered has now been cured." Impurities. Elijah guessed that much of what had been purged from his body had been related to the chemotherapy he'd been forced to undergo. To confirm what the tree had said, Elijah opened his status. Elijah Hart. Level. Archetype. Druid. Class. Not applicable. Specialization. Not applicable. Alignment. Not applicable. Strength. Dexterity. Constitution. 11. Regeneration. 7. Movement. Nature. Cultivation. Body. Formed. Unformed. Elijah shook his head. Not only had he picked up an attunement, whatever that meant, he'd also progressed his body cultivation from unformed to wood. The next question seemed obvious, so he asked, "What comes after wood?" "Stone," said the tree. "But you will have to find an area with much denser Ethera if you want to progress. As it stands, even if you were fortunate enough to find such a place, attempting to take the next step would kill you." "What? How am I supposed to progress, then?" asked Elijah. So impatient was the tree's response. "Barely taken one unsteady step on the path, and already you want to run. The first and easiest way to ensure that you are ready to progress is to gain levels. You can do this in a variety of ways. Killing other creatures is the most common, but any use of your skills or spells will count toward your progression. Like a video game?" The tree either didn't hear Elijah's muttered interruption, or it simply chose not to acknowledge it. It continued, "The other method is to acclimate yourself to increasingly denser Ethera. To do so, you must repeat what you did here today. Over and over, improving bit by bit until you can take the next step." Elijah's eyes flicked to the other categories of core, mind, and soul. So he asked, "What about the others? How do I progress my core?" "I cannot answer that," said the tree. Its voice had already grown dimmer, and Elijah thought it looked even smaller than before. "What I did here was the limit of the assistance I could give, and even that was towing the line between what is and is not allowed. Any further, and it would not be good." "What else can you tell me?" Elijah asked. He was incredibly grateful for the help the tree had given him. The value of ridding his body of cancer, both from an emotional and a physical perspective, was vast, but he wasn't averse to pushing for more. After all, the more information he could get, the better prepared he would be to survive. Perhaps he could even get to Seattle and find his sister and her family. Though he sensed that with how much the world had changed, that might be a far-off goal. "Nothing," said the tree. "I can only wish you luck on your journey. When next we speak, I hope to see that you have progressed." But the tree creature shrank before Elijah's very eyes, growing smaller until it was only a small protrusion atop the branch. At the beginning of their conversation, the tree creature had claimed to be an extension of the tree, and now it had retracted. He leaned back, trying to wrap his head around what had happened. He'd been healed, and if what the tree had said was true, his cultivation had given him a stronger body. What that meant, beyond the basic understanding that it was better, was still a mystery, though. He'd have to do some testing. But first, he needed to head back to the stream and clean himself as well as he could. Then, another question hit him. How long had he been in that crystalline chrysalis of condensed Ethera? It had felt like an eternity, but other than looking up at the sky, which was just as overcast as always, he had no context by which to tell time. He wasn't that hungry or thirsty, so maybe it had all been in his head. The bushberries and the mushroom he'd gathered, as well as the dandelion fluff, had gone the same way as the carpet of moss. None of it was rotten, but rather, it was more like they had become blackened shells of what they'd once been. Perhaps the tree had sustained him somehow. Either way, it didn't affect what he needed to do. So, he pushed himself to his feet and started back the way he'd come. Elijah ran his hand over his head, feeling a light stubble that should not have been there. After all, hair just wasn't supposed to grow that fast, was it? When the plane had crashed and the system had descended upon Earth, he had been completely bald, his hair having been sacrificed at the altar of chemotherapy. By his count, only a couple of days had passed since then. Except for the chrysalis. He had no idea how long he'd been in there. It could have been days, years, months, or it might have been mere hours. His only hints were his budding hair growth, which wasn't really as informative as it could have been. After all, his entire body had changed. He could feel the strength coursing through him. Was it really so unthinkable that cultivating a body of wood might prompt some rapid hair growth? Letting out a sigh, Elijah left the majestic tree behind and went about restoring his stock of dandelion fluff. He might have been cured of his cancer, but his needs were still the same. He needed water, food, and a fire, and that was just the beginning. After gathering 2 pockets full of fluff, Elijah headed back into the woods. On the way back to the fallen cabin, he realized that he'd left his walking stick in the meadow. However, because he expected to find that it had become an empty husk, just like the moss, berries, and mushroom, he chose not to go back for it. He would just find a new one. So, as he walked, he kept an eye out for 3 things. First, he wanted more mushrooms and berries. They wouldn't be enough to sustain him indefinitely. He knew he needed protein and fat, but they would go a long way to staving off hunger while he sorted out his other needs. Second, he wanted a new walking stick. It wasn't absolutely necessary, but he'd always carried a stick while hiking, so it felt right to have one now. Besides, a stout stick could function as an impromptu weapon if he encountered something dangerous. And third, he wanted to gather fallen branches for firewood. Only a few minutes into the woods, Elijah found more bushberries. It wasn't surprising, the little, red berries were all over the place in the Pacific Northwest. He'd hoped to find some blackberries too, but he hadn't been that lucky yet. A couple of minutes later, he found a clump of lion's head mushrooms, which were white and looked a little like bunches of cauliflower. Not for the first time, he silently thanked his father for teaching him about foraging in the wilderness. Otherwise, he'd have run the risk of gathering something poisonous. But that begged the question, was his new body of wood susceptible to poison? He had no idea, but it would be foolish to assume that it wasn't. So, he kept gathering until he finally reached the cabin. Once there, he carefully placed his meager stash of food, a few handfuls of bunchberries and the lion's head mushrooms, on the ground and grabbed the old pot he'd found when he'd first moved into the cabin. It was a little rusted, but he estimated that it would hold a couple of quarts of water. Being that it was his only viable container, he knew he couldn't be terribly picky. With that in hand, Elijah trekked back to the stream and, after spending quite some time washing the black gunk from his body and clothes, he gathered a pot full of water. It was going to be such a pain, going back and forth. It was late in the summer, assuming that he hadn't been in that chrysalis for months, so the only real danger was the unforgiving terrain. But it was navigable. In the winter, though, that would be a different story altogether. Elijah found himself hesitating. He'd gotten sick after drinking the water last time, but that might have been the remnants of his fight against cancer. It didn't necessarily mean that the water was contaminated. Sure, the smart thing to do was to take it back and boil it. However, with the size of the pot, only drinking water that had been boiled would see him spending the majority of his time going back and forth to the stream. The way he saw it, he had 3 options. Just suck it up and resign himself to wasting so much time when it might not even be necessary. He'd learned enough about wilderness survival to know that any time he spent doing that would be time he couldn't spend finding food. He'd gotten lucky with the bunchberries and the mushrooms, but as the weather turned, those would slowly disappear. He needed to stock up, or he'd end up starving to death. And that meant spending as much time as possible gathering food. The second option was to move his camp. But on the first day, he'd looked around, and he hadn't seen any likely shelter. Sleeping out in the open was out of the question. It might work out well enough for now, but the moment the weather turned, it would become a death trap. The old cabin wasn't perfect, but at least it had most of a roof that would protect him from the weather. The third choice was to simply drink the water without boiling it. It was clearly the most convenient option, but that didn't mean it was the right one. After all, he had gotten ill the last time he tried it. But that might have been the cancer or the remnants of failed chemotherapy. The water could have been perfectly potable. In the end, his decision came down to his ability to heal himself with touch of nature. Certainly, being forced to do that wasn't particularly pleasant, but it was a nice safety net if the water was contaminated. If it was, he would just have to use his lone spell to heal himself. But he was also banking on his new body of wood. His attributes hadn't changed, but he'd already felt a qualitative difference in his strength and stamina. So, it wasn't out of the question that he would be more resistant to waterborne diseases and parasites. He hoped that was the case at least. So, Elijah bent down next to the stream, cupped his hands, and drank. The water was clear, and it tasted cool and fresh. But he knew better than most that that didn't mean anything. The water still might make him sick, but he had a way to easily fix that. Sure, he'd lose a bit of hydration if he woke up vomiting, but that was a small price to pay for the convenience of simply drinking from the stream without the necessity of boiling the water. Once Elijah had drunk his fill, he cleaned the pot as best he could, then used it to carry some water back to the cabin. When he got there, he dug out a shallow pit, surrounded it with gathered stones, and leaned the sticks he'd collected together into a pyramid shape. It wasn't ideal, but surviving in the wilderness without supplies never was. You had to take what you could get. To that end, he searched the cabin for a likely piece of wood. There were a few options around the collapsed wall, and he chose the least rotted board he could find. With that done, he settled down and used the old, rusted knife to carve a notch into one side of the board. It took a while, but beneath the rust, the 4-inch blade was sturdier than Elijah could have expected. When the notch was finished, he let out a sigh of relief. Before, even that much work would have left him exhausted. And while he was frustrated and tired after a long day of trekking through the woods, he still had energy to spare. That, as much as anything else, told him that he'd left the effects of the cancer far behind. Back in the meadow, he'd gathered a few pieces of thick horseweed, which he intended to use as a spindle. So, he stripped them down and selected one roughly as big around as his pinky. Then he carved a small dimple in one end. It was intended to increase airflow, a tip he'd learned from his father. So, with all of that set up, Elijah carved a divot on the inner edge of the notch he'd cut into the board. With that done, he was ready to attempt to create his first coal. He'd done it before, but that had been under ideal circumstances while camping with his father. Now though, he had suboptimal tools, barely acceptable materials, and a damp environment. Even if he did manage to get a fire going, it would take a lot of work. But Elijah knew that his life would eventually depend on that fire. Not only would it provide warmth during the chilly nights, but it would also allow him to cook any food he managed to find as well as keep most predators away. He didn't know if the transformed animals in the area, none of which he'd actually seen, aside from the enlarged crabs, would be afraid of fire, but he was banking on their natures remaining static. At least for now. Who knew what else would come? Elijah shook his head and focused on the task at hand. He couldn't plan for everything. He just didn't have enough information. So he could only take it one step at a time, combating any changes as they presented themselves. He set a bit of dandelion fluff on the divot, then followed up with the dimpled end of the spindle. Sitting cross-legged by his poorly constructed fire pit, Elijah set about creating a coal from which he could start the fire. Friction fires were fickle at the best of times, but using a homemade hand drill was an acquired skill. Still, Elijah had done it before, and even if it had been quite some time, he hadn't forgotten the technique. Twisting the spindle between his palms, he rapidly rotated the stick of horseweed. For a few minutes, nothing happened, but eventually, small tendrils of smoke started to drift up from the wood. Nothing caught, though, so he kept at it. He'd optimized the process as much as he could, but that wasn't saying much. So, it still took quite some time before, finally, he created an ember. Leaning forward, he added more dandelion fluff to the coal. It caught easily and burned quickly, so he kept adding to it until he had a nascent flame. Carefully, he pushed forward and placed that flame in the pile of twigs at the bottom of the pyramid of sticks in his fire pit. Then he added some more dandelion fluff. It caught, and he pumped his fist in celebration before adding more and more sticks to the growing flame. The fire wouldn't be much with the fuel he had available, but it was proof that he had remembered his father's teachings. Elijah sat back and admired the growing fire for a long moment before he looked at his hands. He'd always had plenty of calluses, but his battle with cancer had kept him abed for weeks at a time. So, his tender hands had developed a couple of blisters. But he had an answer for that, didn't he? Focusing on his core, Elijah dragged some Ethera into his soul before embracing his spell, Touch of Nature. His hand glowed with verdant light, and before his very eyes, the blisters healed. After that, Elijah inspected the rest of his body, looking for any other injuries, but he found none. The transformation that had come with his body of wood had left him completely healed. Only the blisters he'd gained while making his fire and a few scratches on his feet needed healing. As he finished his inspection, the fire roared to life, finally eating into the pyramid of sticks he'd created. He added a few bigger pieces that he'd foraged, then turned his attention to the food he had gathered. The bunchberries were mildly sweet, but didn't really taste like much else. And the mushroom had a thick, earthy flavor. But Elijah wasn't in any position to be picky. He needed a lot of calories to survive, so he'd take whatever he could get. Still, he had to admit that he wasn't a particular fan of mushrooms. As Elijah sat there, he began to make plans for the future. Some of his needs had been met. He had water, a little food, basic shelter and fire. But there was a time limit on most of it. Foraging for wild edibles was a good start, but it wouldn't sustain him for long. Besides, those sources would be gone soon after the weather turned. He needed something else, preferably meat. That's when he thought of the crabs. He'd already killed one of them, and they hadn't seemed that difficult to find. Perhaps they would offer a ready source of protein. He also had some ideas about how he could go about fishing in the nearby ocean. There were some hurdles he'd have to clear, like making some line and creating a hook, not to mention finding the right spot, but he felt confident he could make it work. It just might take a lot of trial and error. Meanwhile, he'd need to build up his shelter, both for protection against the wildlife as well as the weather. He also needed to explore some more. Rare was the environment that had been completely untouched by man, and he hoped that he could stumble across something he could use. Perhaps some plastic bottles had been washed ashore. Or an old barrel, maybe. The possibilities were endless, and Elijah knew he couldn't afford to ignore any potential means of survival. Just like that, he realized that he'd already made his decision about whether or not he intended to stay. Certainly, there were merits to setting off into the wilderness in search of civilization, but ultimately he decided that it was better to stay put at least until after he made it through the winter. Maybe then he'd be able to make such a journey with some degree of confidence. As Elijah sat there eating bunchberries, he continued to make plans for how he was going to survive. Idly, he wondered how the rest of the world was getting by, but ultimately he couldn't afford to split his focus. He needed to concentrate on keeping himself alive, and then, once his survival was assured, he'd be able to spare thoughts for others.